The ancient world of the 4th century BC was a place where ideas crackled like sparks across the marble streets of Athens, where the echo of Socrates' final words still lingered in the agora, and where the bustling market stalls of the sophists shouted the promise that truth could be shaped by the tongue of the skilled rhetorician. In that restless intellectual climate, the question of how one ought to live rose above the debates about the nature of the cosmos or the best form of government. Socratic ethics, with its relentless call to know thyself, urged each citizen to examine the soul, to strip away the pretensions of wealth and status, and to seek virtue as the sole good. Yet the sophists, with Protagoras proclaiming that man is the measure of all things, offered a counter-current, suggesting that morality could be as fluid as the arguments of a skilled orator, that truth was a matter of persuasion rather than an immutable standard. It was within this vibrant, contested arena that the Hellenistic schools began to take shape, each reaching for a different answer to the problem of the good life. Among them, Cynicism would emerge as a stark, almost shocking response, one that would later cast its long, austere shadow across Stoicism, Epicureanism, and even the minimalist movements of our own age. Diogenes of Sinope, the figure who would become the archetype of the Cynic philosopher, entered this world under circumstances that already hinted at the paradox of his future. He was born around the year 412 BC in the bustling port city of Sinope, a colony on the Black Sea that thrived on trade, shipbuilding, and the exchange of coin. His father, Hicesias, was a wealthy banker, a man who counted his fortunes in the weight of bronze and silver, whose household was filled with the luxuries that most Athenians could only dream of. Young Diogenes, according to the fragments that survive, would have been accustomed to the comforts of a privileged upbringing, soft beds, fine garments, and the endless chatter of merchants discussing the price of olives and the value of a good ship. Yet even as a child, the seeds of discontent were being sown. The stories tell us that he watched his father negotiate with the city's magistrates, that he saw how the glitter of wealth could be both a shield and a weapon. It is said that when he was still a boy, he would sit by the harbor and watch the ships come and go, pondering the notion that the sea, indifferent and boundless, cared little for the fortunes of men. In that early observation, one can already sense the embryonic form of the cynic's later contempt for the artificial trappings of civilization. The turning point that forced Diogenes out of the cocoon of Sinope's affluence came in the form of political exile, a fate that would prove to be a crucible for his philosophy. In the early years of his adulthood, the city of Sinope found itself entangled in a financial scandal that involved the debasement of its coinage. According to the accounts preserved by later writers, Diogenes and his father were implicated in the practice of mixing copper with silver to produce more coins than the treasury could legitimately issue. Whether they acted out of greed or as a misguided attempt to stimulate the city's economy is a matter of debate, but the outcome was clear. The authorities, seeking to restore order and confidence, exiled the family. Diogenes, forced to leave behind his home, his wealth, and the familiar comforts of Sinope, set out for Athens, the heart of philosophical discourse. The exile was not merely a political punishment. It was a rupture that tore him away from the material security he had known, thrusting him into a world where survival depended on wit, resilience, and a willingness to confront the conventions that bound others. It was in Athens that Diogenes encountered Antisthenes, a figure who would become his mentor and the founder of what we now call Cynicism. Antisthenes, himself a direct disciple of Socrates, had taken Socratic ethics to an extreme, arguing that virtue was the only true good and that it could be achieved through rigorous self-discipline, the rejection of luxury, and the cultivation of inner freedom. Antisthenes taught that the good life was not to be found in the accumulation of external goods, but in the mastery of one's own desires. When Diogenes, fresh from exile and carrying the weight of his past, met Antisthenes, the resonance was immediate. He saw in Antisthenes a path that turned the pain of his loss into a deliberate, philosophical stance. The two men would spend countless hours walking the streets of the agora, debating the nature of happiness and testing the limits of social acceptance. Antisthenes gave Diogenes a simple yet profound piece of advice. Live as a dog, he said, meaning that one should live according to nature, without pretensions, and be content with the most basic necessities. Diogenes took this counsel to heart, and it would become the cornerstone of his own teaching. One of the most vivid anecdotes that illustrates the formative power of adversity in Diogenes' life is the shipwreck story that has been told and retold through the centuries. According to the tradition, as a young man, Diogenes set sail from Sinope on a merchant vessel, hoping to reach the intellectual hub of Athens. A sudden storm rose without warning, the sea turning black as ink, the wind howling like a chorus of angry gods. The ship was tossed and broken, and Diogenes found himself clinging to a piece of driftwood as the waves swallowed his companions and the cargo. For days he drifted, his body bruised and his mind tormented, until a humble fisherman rescued him on a small, uninhabited island. The fisherman offered him a simple meal of dried fish and a place to sleep on a hard stone. In that moment, Diogenes realized that the comforts he had once taken for granted were as fragile as the hull of his ship. He learned through the very act of surviving a shipwreck that the body could endure far more than the mind allowed, that the need for wealth, for status, could be eclipsed by the stark reality of nature's indifference. This episode, whether fully factual or embellished by later biographers, serves as a metaphor for the Cynic's later claim that external circumstances are merely the wind that tests the sail, not the source of the ship's direction. The second and perhaps most famous encounter that has cemented Diogenes in the popular imagination is his meeting with Alexander the Great. The story goes that Alexander, having heard of the philosopher who lived in a barrel and who shunned all material comforts, rode his magnificent horse, Bucephalus, into the city of Corinth, seeking out Diogenes, who was, according to the tale, sunbathing in the shade of a large jar. When Alexander arrived, he stood before the philosopher and, in a tone that blended curiosity with imperial authority, asked, "Do you wish anything, O great philosopher?" Diogenes, unperturbed, opened one eye, looked at the towering conqueror, and replied, "Yes. Stand out of my sunlight." The anecdote captures the essence of Cynic defiance, the willingness to confront power with a simple, unadorned truth. It also illustrates a deeper philosophical point, that the philosopher's contentment does not depend on the favor of kings, that the sun's light is a universal right, not a privilege to be hoarded. In the quiet pause that follows the story, one can hear the echo of Diogenes' own life. A man who chose to live in the open air, with nothing but a cloak and a lamp, refusing the trappings of wealth even when offered by the most powerful man on earth. From these personal narratives, we can trace how Cynicism began to diverge sharply from the other Hellenistic schools that would soon rise to prominence, notably Stoicism and Epicureanism. While all three schools shared a concern with how to achieve tranquility, they differed fundamentally in their methods and ultimate goals. Cynicism, as embodied by Diogenes, placed the rejection of external goods at the very heart of its practice. The Cynic argued that virtue could be attained only by living in accordance with nature, which meant stripping away all that is artificial, wealth, fame, even conventional morality when it conflicts with natural law. The Cynic's path was one of asceticism, of public acts that challenged social norms, living in a barrel, walking barefoot through the streets, publicly discarding waste as a statement against excess. Stoicism, which would later be founded by Zeno of Citium, borrowed the Cynic's emphasis on living according to nature, but added a sophisticated logical framework. Stoics believed that the universe is governed by a rational logos, that human beings possess a fragment of this rationality, and that the wise person aligns his will with the cosmic order. Unlike the Cynics, Stoics accepted the necessity of social roles, argued for the importance of duty to family and state, and cultivated a complex system of ethics, physics, and logic. Epicureanism, on the other hand, took a different route. Founded by Epicurus, it taught that the highest good is pleasure, understood not as hedonistic indulgence but as the absence of pain, ataraxia, and disturbance. Epicureans advocated for modest living, the cultivation of friendships, and the pursuit of intellectual pleasures, but they did not reject wealth outright. Rather, they saw it as a means to secure a tranquil life, provided it did not become a source of anxiety. In this way, Cynicism stands apart as the most radical, the most confrontational of the three, demanding that the philosopher become a living critique of society's values, rather than a participant in its philosophical debates. The radical nature of Cynic practice did not go unchallenged. Early critics, many of whom were aligned with the more established schools, accused the Cynics of being mere hedonistic rebels, of swapping one form of indulgence for another. The argument went that by deliberately embracing poverty and public spectacle, the Cynics were indulging in a different sort of pleasure, the pleasure of shock, the thrill of being the outsider, the satisfaction of flaunting societal norms. A contemporary critic, the poet Diogenes, wrote that the Cynics parade their poverty as virtue, yet they are no less slaves to desire than the rich. This line of criticism suggested that the Cynics were not transcending desire but merely redirecting it, that they were still bound by the same human cravings for attention and notoriety. The Platonic accusation of moral relativism added another layer of intellectual opposition. In the dialogue Gorgias, Plato, through the voice of Socrates, questions the Cynic's claim that virtue is independent of any external standard, suggesting that without a universal form of the good, the Cynic's moral judgments become arbitrary. Plato's critique can be heard in the passage where he asks, if virtue is merely the absence of excess, who decides what constitutes excess? Is it not the same as saying that each man may define his own good? This Platonic charge implied that the Cynic's dismissal of conventional morality opened the door to a kind of ethical anarchy, where each individual could claim virtue based on personal preference, thereby undermining the very possibility of a shared moral order. Yet the Cynics responded to these critiques not with abstract argumentation, but with lived example. When critics called them hedonistic, the Cynics would point to their deliberate rejection of comfort as the ultimate denial of pleasure. When accused of moral relativism, they would invoke the image of the dog, unbound by human law, guided only by natural instinct, to illustrate that the good is found in living in accordance with nature, not in the shifting sands of human convention. Diogenean anecdotes abound. One story tells of Diogenes walking through the marketplace with a lantern in broad daylight, announcing that he was searching for an honest man. When a passerby asked why he needed a lamp, Diogenes replied, "Because the darkness of deceit is everywhere and I must illuminate the path." Another tale recounts how he entered a banquet hall, took the host's wine, and poured it onto the floor, declaring, "Let us drink the wine of truth, not the wine of pretension." These acts, absurd to the onlookers, were intended to expose the hollowness of social rituals, to demonstrate that the true nourishment of the soul does not come from feasting on material excess, but from a clear conscience. The influence of Cynicism did not end with Diogenes. In the decades after his death, his ideas were taken up, transformed, and integrated into other philosophical traditions. The most direct lineage can be traced to the Stoic founder Zeno of Citium, who, after a shipwreck that left him stranded in Athens, encountered the cynic Crates, a disciple of Diogenes. Crates, who had famously given away his wealth and lived in a simple cloak, taught Zeno the importance of virtue and self-sufficiency. Zeno adopted the Cynic's emphasis on living according to nature, but built upon it a comprehensive system of logic, physics, and ethics that would become Stoicism. He retained the Stoic ideal of apatheia, freedom from destructive passions, while softening the Cynic's public provocation, allowing the Stoic to engage in public life and fulfill civic duties. This synthesis illustrates how Cynicism served as a seed, a catalyst for a more systematic philosophy that could be practiced within the structures of the polis without losing its core commitment to inner freedom. Even beyond the ancient world, the echo of Cynic thought can be heard in modern minimalist movements. In today's society, where consumerism is often equated with success, a growing number of people are turning to minimalism, tiny house living, and digital detoxes as a means of reclaiming autonomy over their lives. They, like Diogenes, ask themselves what truly constitutes a good life, and they often conclude that it is not the accumulation of gadgets, clothing, or status symbols, but the ability to move freely, to think clearly, and to be unburdened by unnecessary obligations. The modern minimalist might quote Diogenes' famous line, "I am looking for an honest man," not as a literal search for a virtuous individual, but as a metaphor for seeking authenticity in a world saturated with curated images. The minimalist's decision to own only a few possessions mirrors the Cynic's rejection of wealth, and the digital detox's emphasis on stepping away from the constant noise of social media parallels Diogenes' choice to sit in the sunlight, unbothered by the chatter of the crowd. To understand the full texture of Diogenes' philosophy, we must also consider the historical anecdotes that illustrate his willingness to confront the powerful and to embody his teachings in the most literal sense. One such story recounts how Diogenes was once captured by pirates while traveling along the coast of Asia Minor. The pirates, seeing an opportunity for ransom, demanded a hefty sum from his family. Diogenes, upon being brought aboard the pirate ship, refused to pay any ransom, declaring that the only thing that belongs to a man is his own will. He then proceeded to eat the ship's provisions, to sit on the deck in a posture of indifference, and to laugh at the pirates' attempts to intimidate him. When the pirate captain asked why he did not fear death, Diogenes answered, "I fear only the loss of my freedom, and that is something no man can take away." The pirates, bewildered by his composure, eventually released him, perhaps realizing that they could not buy the spirit that Diogenes held dear. This anecdote underscores the Cynic's belief that external circumstances, whether wealth, captivity, or social pressure, cannot diminish the inner liberty that defines true virtue. Another anecdote highlights Diogenes' willingness to challenge the sacred symbols of his time. According to the accounts, Diogenes once entered the temple of Zeus at Olympia, carrying a plucked chicken in his hand. He announced loudly that the greatest god is not the one who is worshipped in marble, but the one who provides us with food and shelter. He then proceeded to throw the chicken onto the altar, proclaiming that the true divine is the sustenance of life, not the marble statue that stands idle. The priests were outraged, the crowd murmured in disapproval, yet Diogenes stood unflinching. his eyes shining with the conviction that the divine is found in the practical, everyday realities of existence, not in distant, abstract worship. This act, though shocking, illustrates the Cynic's broader critique of religious and societal conventions that elevate form over substance. The philosophical legacy of Diogenes is also preserved in his own words, in the terse, piercing sayings that have survived through the centuries. When asked why he lived in a barrel, he replied, "It is not the barrel that makes me a philosopher, but the fact that I do not need a house." When a wealthy patron offered him a sum of money to stop his public demonstrations, Diogenes responded, "Give me a loaf of bread, and I will eat it in the street. Give me a coin, and I will spend it on a lamp to search for the honest man." These sayings capture the essence of Cynic thought, a focus on self-sufficiency, a disdain for material excess, and a relentless pursuit of moral clarity. Antisthenes, his teacher, contributed his own aphorisms, such as, "It is better to die of hunger than to eat with the rich," which echo the Cynic's valorization of virtue over comfort. Plato, though critical, could not ignore the force of their ideas, and in the Republic he writes, "The Cynics, though they claim to despise wealth, are in truth the most honest of men, for they have nothing to hide." Even the Stoics, in their later works, acknowledge the Cynic's influence. Seneca writes, "The Cynic's lamp shines in the darkness, showing us the path that the Stoic must follow with reason." When we examine the broader tapestry of philosophical development, we see that the Cynic's insistence on living according to nature resonates with the later existentialists. With the modern philosophers who argue that authenticity is achieved by confronting the absurdity of existence and rejecting inauthentic social masks. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, praised Diogenes as a free spirit, noting that his shamelessness and rejection of the herd embody the kind of individualism that Nietzsche would later celebrate. In the same vein, the modern philosopher Albert Camus, in his essay on the absurd, would have found in Diogenes a model of the rebel who embraces the meaningless of the world while creating his own values through action. These cross-references illustrate that cynicism, far from being a marginal footnote, has been a persistent thread weaving through the history of thought, challenging each generation to reconsider what it means to live well. In sum, the journey from Socratic Athens to the birthplace of cynicism is a story of transformation, of a society that moved from the abstract debates of virtue to the lived practice of virtue in the streets. Diogenes of Sinope, born into wealth, exiled by political scandal, and reborn under the tutelage of Antisthenes, embodied the radical possibility that philosophy is not merely a discipline of the mind, but a way of being that can overturn the most entrenched values of power, wealth, and convention. His shipwreck, his encounter with Alexander, his public provocations, and his austere lifestyle together form a mosaic that illustrates the depth and daring of Cynic thought. The criticisms he faced, accusations of hedonistic rebellion and moral relativism, only sharpened his resolve to live as a living critique of society. The later synthesis of Cynic ethics into Stoic philosophy and the echo of his ideas in modern minimalist movements demonstrate the enduring relevance of his teachings. As we reflect on Diogenes' lamp shining in the midday sun, we are invited to ask ourselves, what are the barrels we cling to? What luxuries do we mistake for virtue? And most importantly, can we, like Diogenes, find the courage to step out of the shadows of convention and into the clear, unfiltered light of a life guided solely by nature and reason? The answer perhaps lies not in the words of any later philosopher, but in the quiet, deliberate breath of the individual who chooses to live truly as a dog, free, unencumbered, and ever watchful of the honest man within. Imagine a quiet street in ancient Athens, the sun already high, the market stalls bustling, and a lone figure wrapped in a simple cloak, his only possessions a cracked bowl and a lantern he carries even in the bright day. He walks not with the swagger of a politician nor the measured steps of a scholar, but with the deliberate, almost playful gait of someone who has already decided that the world's wealth is not measured in gold or marble, but in something far more intimate. The capacity to be self-sufficient, to belong to no single city, and to live in harmony with the very nature that surrounds us. This is Diogenes of Sinope, the Cynic whose philosophy rests upon three interlocking pillars: autarkeia, the radical self-sufficiency that frees the soul from external dependence; cosmopolitanism, the boundless brotherhood that declares every human being a fellow citizen of the world; and the life according to nature, a call to align our actions with the simple, unadorned order of the cosmos. As we explore each of these doctrines, we will see how they are not abstract theories, but lived practices, illustrated by the most vivid anecdotes of Diogenes' own life, and how they echo, clash, and converse with the great moral systems of Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and even the ideas that shape our contemporary search for radical simplicity and global citizenship. Let us begin with autarkeia, the Greek term that translates as self-sufficiency, but which, in the mind of Diogenes, is far more than a mere economic condition. It is a profound inner independence, a freedom from the endless cravings that the city of Athens, with its festivals, its rhetoric, its endless debates, constantly tries to stir within us. Diogenes famously declared, "I have a dog's nature, and I am content with a bowl of water." In that terse statement lies a philosophy that the good life does not require opulent banquets, nor the approval of the polis, but a disciplined mastery over one's own desires. He lived this doctrine literally. He made his home in a large ceramic jar, what some later called a tub, on the streets of Athens, refusing the comforts of a proper dwelling, the warmth of a hearth, the softness of a bed. When asked why he chose such a humble abode, he replied, "What is the use of a house when the world itself is a house for the soul?" By stripping away the external trappings of wealth, Diogenes sought to reveal the inner wealth that cannot be taken away by famine, war, or the caprice of a tyrant. Contrast this with Plato's vision in the Republic, where the just city is built upon a strict hierarchy of classes, each with its designated role, each receiving the goods appropriate to its function. For Plato, the guardian class must be educated, must own certain tools, must be provided with the necessities that enable them to fulfill their duty to the state. The philosopher king, the ultimate ruler, is not a beggar on the street, but a cultivated mind, sustained by the best of the city's resources. In this framework, self-sufficiency is not a personal virtue, but a communal arrangement. Each part of the whole contributes to the harmony of the whole. Diogenes, by contrast, turns the idea on its head. He asks, if the city can provide for the needs of the guardian, why does the guardian need to own a single bowl? His answer is that the true guardian must be free from the very notion of ownership, for ownership creates attachment, and attachment creates the potential for corruption. In a sense, Diogenes' autarkeia is a radical inversion of Plato's communal provision. Where Plato sees the state as the source of sufficiency, Diogenes sees the state as a source of distraction, and the individual's own inner discipline as the true source of sufficiency. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, offers yet another perspective on self-sufficiency, though he would not have called it autarkeia in the same sense. Aristotle argues that eudaimonia, the flourishing life, is achieved through the exercise of virtue in accordance with reason, and that certain external goods, health, wealth, friends, are necessary conditions for a complete life. He writes, "The good for man is an activity of the soul in conformity with perfect virtue." Yet he also acknowledges that a certain degree of material comfort is required to enable the virtuous activity. In his view, a man who is perpetually hungry or cold cannot fully exercise virtue because his mind is preoccupied with survival. Diogenes would likely smile at this concession, for he would argue that the desire for material comfort is itself a vice, a craving that can be overcome through disciplined practice. He would point to his own life as a proof. "I have no need for a palace, for I have the sun, the wind, and the earth to nourish my spirit." The tension between Aristotle's modest endorsement of external goods and Diogenes' outright rejection of them creates a fertile ground for debate. Is there a threshold beyond which material comfort becomes a hindrance rather than a help? Diogenes seems to say yes, and he demonstrates it by living at the very edge of what is socially acceptable, thereby forcing us to confront the assumptions we hold about what we truly need. From autarkeia we move to the second pillar, cosmopolitanism, a term that in Diogenes' time meant citizen of the world. When asked where he was from, Diogenes would answer, "I am a citizen of the world." He rejected the narrow loyalties that bound most Greeks to their polis, their city-state, and instead proclaimed a universal brotherhood that transcended borders, language, and even class. This cosmopolitan stance is perhaps best illustrated by one of the most famous anecdotes of his life, the story of Diogenes searching for an honest man with a lantern in broad daylight. He walked the streets of Athens, lantern held aloft, proclaiming, "I am looking for an honest man." The image is striking not only for its theatricality, but for its moral purpose. By turning his lantern toward the city, Diogenes was not merely mocking the citizens. He was exposing the moral darkness he perceived in a society that prized wealth and reputation over integrity. In doing so, he invited every passerby to examine their own conscience, to ask themselves whether they could be the honest man he sought. The cosmopolitan impulse also appears in the way Diogenes treated strangers and patrons. When a wealthy patron offered him a luxurious cup made of fine plaster, a gift meant to display generosity, Diogenes famously rejected it, crushing the cup in his hand and declaring, "I have no need for such trinkets. My cup is the open sky." This episode, sometimes called the plaster cup anecdote, is more than a display of disdain for material gifts. It is a vivid illustration of his belief that true citizenship does not involve the exchange of favors, but the sharing of a common humanity. He refused to be indebted because indebtedness creates a hierarchy, a bond that ties one person to another in a way that undermines the equal status of all humans. By rejecting the patron's offering, Diogenes affirmed that the only bond that matters is the one formed by mutual recognition of each other's humanity. Contrast this with the cosmopolitan vision of the Stoics, who, after Diogenes, would develop a more systematic notion of universal brotherhood. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that all humans are parts of a single rational organism, and that virtue consists in recognizing this unity. Yet the Stoics retained a certain respect for social duties. They argued that one must fulfill one's roles as a parent, a citizen, a friend, while maintaining an inner detachment. Diogenes, on the other hand, seemed to disregard conventional social roles altogether, often behaving in ways that shocked his contemporaries. When a Corinthian magistrate once demanded that Diogenes leave the public space because he was disturbing the peace, Diogenes responded by walking into the magistrate's house, laying down his lantern and saying, "You have made a home for me, now you must also make room for my philosophy." The magistrate, flustered, could not punish a man who simply occupied his own space without demanding anything. This confrontation highlights the tension between Diogenes' radical claim to universal belonging and the Stoic insistence that even the most detached philosopher must respect the civic order. Diogenes' cosmopolitanism is not merely an abstract declaration. It is a lived practice that challenges the very foundations of political authority and social hierarchy. The third pillar, the life according to nature, ties together autarkeia and cosmopolitanism into a single, coherent way of being. For Diogenes, nature is not an abstract principle to be studied in a lecture hall, but the immediate, palpable world that surrounds us. The sun that warms our skin, the wind that carries our breath, the earth that supplies our food. He argued that human beings, like any other creature, have a natural set of needs, and that the art of living lies in satisfying those needs without excess. In his own words, nature has given us all we need, we only add the rest. This sentiment resonates with the Aristotelian notion of the golden mean, yet Diogenes pushes the mean to an extreme, suggesting that the mean is often found at the very edge of deprivation, not at a moderate indulgence. He lived this principle by eating only what he could find in the market's waste, by sleeping on the ground, by using his own body as a shelter. In doing so, he demonstrated that the natural life is one of simplicity, of direct engagement with the environment, without the artificial layers that society builds around us. Plato in the Republic offers a different conception of living according to nature. He argues that the ideal city mirrors the soul, the rational part rules, the spirited part supports, and the appetitive part follows. The just life, then, is one where each part performs its proper function, and the city provides the structures, education, property, law to ensure this harmony. In this view, nature is a guide for structuring society, not a call to abandon it. Diogenes would likely ask, if the city is the soul, why does it need walls, laws, and property at all? He would answer that the soul, when freed from the artificial constraints of property and law, can return to its natural state, free, unencumbered, and honest. In this sense, Diogenes' life according to nature is a radical critique of the very idea that civilization can improve upon nature. He sees civilization as a veil that hides our true nature, while the Stoics, later on, would argue that civilization can help us cultivate virtue by providing a framework within which reason can flourish. The modern relevance of these three pillars is striking. In an age where consumer culture encourages endless accumulation, the principle of autarkeia finds echo in the minimalist movements, in the rise of tiny houses, in the practice of voluntary simplicity. Think of the contemporary radical simplicity advocate who lives in a converted school bus, who carries only a few belongings, who refuses to own a car, and who says, "My happiness is not measured in square footage, but in the depth of my relationships." This modern figure mirrors Diogenes' lantern-carrying search for honesty, because by stripping away the noise of material excess, they create space to see the moral landscape more clearly. The philosopher's ancient claim that the good life is a life of needlessness resonates with the modern mantra that less is more, yet the debate continues. Does a life of extreme minimalism risk neglecting the social responsibilities that come with being part of a community? The Stoic critique of Diogenes, that extreme asceticism undermines social duties, remains a live objection today. If we all retreated into our own jars, would we abandon the care for our neighbors, the obligations to family, the participation in democratic life? This tension invites us to consider a balanced path, perhaps one that adopts Diogenes' spirit of self-sufficiency while retaining a sense of civic responsibility. Similarly, cosmopolitanism as articulated by Diogenes anticipates the modern concept of global citizenship. In an increasingly interconnected world, the idea that we belong to a single humanity, that borders are porous, that we share a common destiny, is more relevant than ever. International organizations, climate agreements, and movements for refugee rights all rest upon the belief that we are, at some level, citizens of the world. Yet the same challenges that confronted Diogenes, nationalism, parochialism, the temptation to view others as outsiders, still arise. When Diogenes turned his lantern toward the Athenian market, he was exposing a moral darkness that is still present when we see the wealth disparity between nations or the exploitation of labor across borders. His insistence that I am a citizen of the world can be heard today in the slogans of activists who march for climate justice, who claim that the planet is a shared home, and that our responsibilities extend beyond the limits of our own city-state. Aristotle's caution that some comforts are necessary for eudaimonia also finds a contemporary echo. In the field of public policy, we see debates about the minimum standard of living, about universal basic income, about access to healthcare and education. Aristotle would argue that without a certain baseline of material security, individuals cannot fully exercise virtue. Diogenes, by living on the streets, seems to deny this premise, yet his example also forces us to ask whether the baseline he set, food, shelter, basic health, is truly sufficient, or whether his rejection of any surplus is a philosophical stance that cannot be universally applied. The modern conversation about basic needs versus luxury can be enriched by revisiting this ancient dispute, reminding us that the line between necessary and superfluous is not fixed but culturally and philosophically negotiated. Let us return to the two vivid anecdotes that bring these abstract ideas into concrete life. The first, the plaster cup episode, occurred when a wealthy patron, perhaps a member of the Athenian aristocracy, approached Diogenes with a cup of fine plaster, polished to a shine that caught the sunlight. The patron said, "Take this, Diogenes, as a token of my generosity." Diogenes took the cup, examined its smooth surface, then crushed it in his hand, scattering shards onto the dusty street. He turned to the patron and declared, "I have no need for a cup that does not hold water. The sky is my vessel." In this act, Diogenes demonstrates autarkeia. He rejects the external provision of a material object, asserting that his needs are already met by the natural world. He also illustrates cosmopolitanism. The patron's gift, intended as a bridge between social classes, is refused because it reinforces a hierarchy. By crushing the cup, Diogenes symbolically shatters the social contract that binds the elite to the poor through patronage. He invites us to consider whether true generosity lies in the giving of things or in the recognition of the other's self-sufficiency. The second anecdote, the confrontation with the Corinthian magistrate, showcases Diogenes' commitment to living according to nature, even in the face of authority. The magistrate tasked with maintaining public order ordered Diogenes to leave the agora because his presence, lying in the sun, holding a lantern, speaking blunt truths, was deemed disruptive. Diogenes, rather than retreating, entered the magistrate's own house, set his lantern upon the threshold, and said, "You have opened your door to me, now you must open your mind to my philosophy." The magistrate, embarrassed, could not punish a man who had not broken any law, only a social convention. Here the principle of autarkeia appears again. Diogenes does not rely on the permission of the state to occupy space. His self-sufficiency grants him the right to be wherever he wishes. Cosmopolitanism is evident in his claim to a universal right of presence, not limited to the boundaries of any city. And the life according to nature is manifested in his simple act of sitting in the sun, using only his body and his lantern, without any need for a formal dwelling. This episode underscores the tension between individual freedom and civic order, a tension that modern democracies still wrestle with when citizens protest, occupy public spaces, or demand the right to be heard. Now let us examine the philosophical arguments that undergird each pillar, beginning with autarkeia. Diogenes argued that the desire for external goods creates a dependency that enslaves the soul. He believed that the human being, by nature, possesses everything necessary for a good life: reason, the capacity for friendship, the ability to find nourishment in the simplest of foods. To illustrate, he would point to a dog, content with a bone, a place to sleep, and a companion. He claimed, "I am a man, but I will live like a dog if that is the path to virtue." In this view, the pursuit of wealth is a form of moral corruption, a distraction that pulls the soul away from its natural purpose. Autarkeia, therefore, is not a call to poverty for its own sake, but a disciplined practice of recognizing that true wealth lies within. By living in a jar, Diogenes externalizes this inner state, making visible what is usually hidden. The possibility of a life free from the tyranny of desire. Plato's Republic offers a counterpoint. The guardians must be provided with material support so that they can focus on the pursuit of truth. Plato acknowledges that the human soul can be swayed by bodily needs, and therefore the state must supply the basics, food, shelter, clothing, to keep the guardians from being distracted by personal concerns. Yet Diogenes would retort, if a guardian can be content with a single bowl, why does the state need to furnish a palace? This rhetorical question invites us to reconsider the relationship between material provision and moral excellence. Does the provision of material goods nurture virtue, or does it foster complacency? Diogenes' answer suggests the latter, that virtue thrives best when stripped of the comforts that can become crutches. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics adds nuance by recognizing that some external goods are necessary for the practice of virtue. He writes, "The good for man is an activity of the soul in conformity with perfect virtue, and this activity is best performed in a context where basic needs are met." Aristotle does not reject material goods outright. He merely places them as conditions, not ends. He also acknowledges that the right amount of wealth is the one that allows the virtuous person to act without undue hindrance. In this light, Diogenes' extreme austerity can be seen as a methodological exaggeration, a way to test the limits of what is truly necessary. By living on the edge, he forces us to ask, where is the line between the necessary and the superfluous? Aristotle would likely argue that Diogenes has crossed that line, but the philosopher's point is not to prescribe a universal lifestyle, but to expose the hidden dependencies that many people accept without question. Turning to cosmopolitanism, Diogenes' claim to universal brotherhood rests on the belief that all human beings share a common rational nature, a spark of logos that binds us together. He famously said, "I am a citizen of the world," and he lived this claim by treating everyone, from the richest patron to the poorest beggar, with the same blunt honesty. In his view, the divisions created by city-state identities are artificial, based on geography rather than on the shared essence of humanity. This view anticipates the Stoic concept of the cosmopolis, the world city, where all rational beings are members of a single community. Yet Diogenes differs from the Stoics in his method. He does not seek to cultivate virtue within the framework of a larger civic order. He seeks to dismantle the very notion of order that separates us. The Stoics, such as Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, argue that while we are all citizens of the cosmos, we still have roles within our local communities that we must fulfill. They maintain that social duties, family, friendship, civic participation, are expressions of our rational nature, and that neglecting them would be a failure of virtue. In this sense, the Stoic critique of Diogenes is that his radical disregard for social conventions undermines the relational aspect of virtue. If we are all part of one human family, does that not entail caring for one another in concrete ways, not merely proclaiming a shared identity? Diogenes would reply, perhaps, that caring for others does not require material gifts or adherence to social rituals. It requires honesty, the willingness to expose hypocrisy, and the courage to live openly in the public eye. By refusing the plaster cup, he demonstrates that true care is not about giving objects, but about refusing to reinforce hierarchies that keep people dependent. Aristotle again offers a perspective on cosmopolitanism, albeit a more limited one. He acknowledges that humans are political animals, destined to live in polis, but he also recognizes that friendship philia can extend beyond city borders. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he writes that the highest form of friendship is based on virtue, and such friendships can be formed between strangers who share the same commitment to the good. Diogenes embodies this ideal, seeking honest men wherever they might be, regardless of their civic affiliation. Yet Aristotle would argue that the polis provides the necessary structure for cultivating virtue, and that abandoning it entirely could lead to isolation rather than universal brotherhood. Diogenes' life, then, can be seen as a provocative experiment that tests the limits of Aristotle's claim. Can one truly achieve virtue without the scaffolding of a political community? The answer remains contested, but the experiment itself enriches the philosophical conversation. The third pillar, living according to nature, is perhaps the most tangible in Diogenes' daily practice. He argued that humans, like other animals, have natural needs that should be satisfied simply and directly. He famously declared, "I am looking for an honest man, and I have found no one, but I have found a dog that is content with a bowl." By aligning his life with the rhythms of the sun, the wind, and the earth, Diogenes demonstrates a profound ecological awareness that resonates with contemporary environmental philosophy. He lives as a prototype of what modern ecologists call a low-impact lifestyle, one that minimizes waste, reduces consumption, and seeks harmony with the ecosystems that sustain us. His choice to sleep in a public space, to eat whatever he could find, to use a simple lantern for illumination, all reflect a commitment to the natural order. Plato's vision of the just city, however, includes a sophisticated division of labor and a system of property that aims to ensure that each citizen receives what they need. In this framework, nature is a guide for the organization of society, but the city itself is an artificial construct that refines natural tendencies into a harmonious whole. Plato would argue that living according to nature does not mean abandoning the city, but rather using reason to shape the city in accordance with natural justice. Diogenes, by contrast, sees the city as a source of corruption, a place where artificial desires are cultivated. He asks, if the city can be arranged to reflect nature, why does it not already do so? His answer is that the city's institutions are too entangled with power and wealth to ever truly reflect nature without a radical reorientation, one that begins with the individual's own renunciation of excess. Aristotle's view again provides a middle ground. He acknowledges that humans have natural needs, but he also emphasizes that the good life involves the cultivation of virtues that go beyond mere survival. In his view, living according to nature includes the development of rational capacities, the pursuit of knowledge, and the participation in political life. Thus, the natural life for Aristotle is not a life of pure asceticism, but a life that balances bodily needs with intellectual and civic fulfillment. Diogenes' extreme minimalism can be seen as a provocative reduction, a way to strip away the non-essential so that the essential, reason, virtue, can shine more clearly. Yet Aristotle would caution that a life devoid of communal engagement may lack the very opportunities to practice virtue that require interaction with others. Having examined the ancient arguments, let us now explore how these ideas reverberate in our contemporary world. In recent years, the movement toward radical simplicity has taken many forms. People living in tiny houses, digital nomads who work remotely while carrying only a backpack, and those who practice downshifting, deliberately reducing their work hours to gain more time for community and personal growth. These modern practitioners often cite Diogenes as an inspiration, even if they do not name him directly. They echo his sentiment that the good life is not found in the accumulation of things, but in the cultivation of inner freedom. Yet they also grapple with the Stoic critique. If we withdraw too far from society, do we abandon our responsibilities to those who depend on us? The answer is not simple. Some argue that by living simply, we reduce our ecological footprint, thereby contributing to the common good, a form of social duty that aligns with both Diogenes and Stoic concerns. Others caution that extreme withdrawal can become a form of privilege, a way for the well-off to opt out of systemic problems without confronting them directly. Global citizenship, the modern incarnation of Diogenes' cosmopolitanism, is now taught in schools, celebrated in international festivals, and embodied in the work of NGOs that operate across borders. The United Nations declares that every human being is entitled to the rights and responsibilities of global citizenship, a statement that would have delighted Diogenes. Yet the same global institutions also face criticism for perpetuating inequities, for imposing standards that echo the very hierarchies Diogenes rejected. When we read Diogenes' lantern story, we might ask ourselves, what modern lantern do we hold? Is it social media, a platform for exposing injustice, or is it the complacent acceptance of the status quo? In either case, the act of searching for honesty in a crowded marketplace remains a potent metaphor for the challenges of contemporary global ethics. Returning to the philosophical debates, the Stoic critique of Diogenes' asceticism can be sharpened with a modern example. Consider a community that decides to adopt a zero-waste lifestyle, refusing single-use plastics and minimizing consumption. While the intention aligns with Diogenes' autarkeia, the community must still engage with local authorities to ensure waste management, must teach children to navigate a world still filled with consumerist pressures, and must collaborate with neighboring towns to share resources. The Stoic would argue that a balance must be struck. The pursuit of self-sufficiency should not lead to the neglect of civic duties. Diogenes, however, would likely respond that the very act of confronting the authorities, of exposing their complicity in waste, is itself a civic duty, one that requires boldness, not conformity. Aristotle's claim that some comforts are necessary for eudaimonia also finds a contemporary echo in debates about universal basic income, UBI. Proponents argue that providing a minimal level of financial security enables individuals to pursue education, creativity, and civic participation without the constant anxiety of survival. This aligns with Aristotle's view that external goods are prerequisites for virtue. Critics, perhaps channeling Diogenes, might say that guaranteeing a certain level of comfort could breed complacency, that true virtue arises when one is forced to confront scarcity and thereby refine one's character. The dialogue between these positions mirrors the ancient tension. Does a modest degree of material security empower virtue, or does it dull the edge of self-sufficiency that Diogenes prized? The answer may lie in a nuanced middle path where the safety net exists but the spirit of autarkeia, learning to be content with less, remains cultivated. To deepen our understanding, let us consider an analogy drawn from nature itself. Imagine a river that flows through a valley, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent. The river does not cling to the banks, it moves freely, adapting to the terrain, nourishing the land, yet never demanding more than what the landscape provides. Diogenes' autarkeia resembles the river's capacity to be self-sufficient, taking only what is needed to sustain its flow. His cosmopolitanism mirrors the river's journey through many territories, touching different peoples, yet remaining a single, continuous entity. The life according to nature is the river's alignment with the natural gradient, moving downstream without artificial obstruction. When a dam is built, a metaphor for the state's imposition of laws, property, and hierarchy, the river's natural course is altered, its freedom compromised. Diogenes, by refusing to be damned, demonstrates the philosophical insight that true freedom lies in flowing with nature, not against it. Yet the dam also serves a purpose. It can provide irrigation, generate power, protect downstream communities. This reflects the Stoic and Aristotelian view that some structures, though artificial, can serve the common good when used wisely. The tension between the river's natural flow and the dam's utility encapsulates the age-old debate between radical self-sufficiency and socially mediated order. Historical anecdotes further illuminate these ideas. In one story, Diogenes encountered a wealthy Athenian who boasted of his vast collection of fine linens, claiming that such luxuries elevated his soul. Diogenes, unperturbed, walked over, lifted the linen, and tossed it into the street, shouting, "If this cloth can clothe my body, it can clothe my mind." The crowd gasped, the patron blushed, and the onlookers were left to ponder whether the fine fabric truly added any virtue to its owner. This episode illustrates the emptiness of material excess and reinforces the autarkeia principle. True wealth is internal, not external. In another episode, a magistrate from Corinth, tasked with maintaining public decorum, ordered Diogenes to cease his public displays of shamelessness. Diogenes responded by taking a public seat on the magistrate's own throne, declaring, "If you demand order, then let order be found in the simplicity of a man who needs nothing." The magistrate, caught between his duty and the absurdity of Diogenes' gesture, was forced to confront the arbitrary nature of authority. Here, the cosmopolitan claim becomes evident. Diogenes does not recognize the magistrate's local jurisdiction as a limit to his universal right to exist openly. His act also embodies living according to nature, as he uses the simplest of objects, a seat, to make a profound point about the artificiality of power. These stories, while colorful, also serve as vehicles for deeper philosophical reflection. They ask us to consider, what is the role of the philosopher in society? Is it to advise from the safety of an academy, as Plato's philosopher king does, or to live on the streets, challenging norms through lived example, as Diogenes does? The answer may lie in recognizing that philosophy can be both contemplative and performative. Diogenes' performative acts, searching for an honest man with a lantern, crushing the plaster cup, occupying the magistrate's throne, are not mere stunts. They are embodied arguments that speak louder than any treatise. They force observers to confront the gap between their professed values and their actual practices. When we bring these ancient debates into the present, we see that the conversation continues in the realm of technology. Consider the rise of digital minimalism, a movement that encourages people to reduce their screen time, delete unnecessary apps, and reclaim attention from the constant barrage of notifications. Advocates often cite Diogenes' lantern as a metaphor for the clarity that comes when we turn off the digital noise and focus on what truly matters. Yet critics argue from a Stoic perspective that technology can be a tool for virtue if used wisely, rather than an inherent threat. The modern digital lantern can illuminate truth, but it can also cast shadows of distraction. The balance, again, mirrors the ancient tension. How much simplicity is beneficial, and where does the line cross into neglect of useful tools? In the realm of global citizenship, the modern concept of planetary boundaries echoes Diogenes' insistence on living within the limits set by nature. Scientists warn that humanity is exceeding the Earth's capacity to absorb carbon, to maintain biodiversity, and to sustain fresh water. The call for a planetary ethic, recognizing that we are all citizens of a shared Earth, resonates with Diogenes' cosmopolitanism. Yet the implementation of such an ethic requires coordinated political action, laws, and institutions, structures that Diogenes would likely view with suspicion. The Stoic critique becomes relevant. Can we achieve global responsibility without some form of governance? Diogenes would perhaps answer, governance is only as good as the virtue of those who govern. If they are not honest, no law can compel true brotherhood. This rhetorical question invites us to examine the quality of our leaders, the sincerity of our commitments, and the extent to which we, as individuals, embody the principles we demand of our institutions. Returning to the primary sources, let us hear Diogenes in his own words, as recorded by later writers. He is said to have declared, "I am looking for an honest man," a line that has become a timeless meme for the search for integrity. He also famously told Alexander the Great, who once approached him and asked if there was anything he could do for him, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." In that terse reply, Diogenes asserts his independence from even the greatest power, emphasizing that his autonomy cannot be bought, given, or taken away. These quotes, simple yet profound, encapsulate the essence of his three doctrines: self-sufficiency, universal belonging, and natural living. Plato, in the Republic, offers a contrasting image. Justice is the harmony of the parts of the soul, each doing its proper work. He imagines a city where each class performs its function, and the guardian class, educated in philosophy, leads the state toward the good. This vision of order and hierarchy stands in stark relief against Diogenes' chaotic, lamp-bearing wanderings. Yet both philosophers share a common goal, the cultivation of virtue. Their methods diverge, but their end, human flourishing, remains the same. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics writes, "Virtue is a habit disposed toward action, lying in a mean." He emphasizes the middle way, the balance between excess and deficiency. Diogenes, by living at what many would deem the extreme deficiency, forces us to reconsider where the mean truly lies. Is the mean always a moderate point, or can it be a point of radical departure that reveals the excesses we have become blind to? The Stoic critique, articulated by Seneca in his letters to Lucilius, argues that the wise man should not abandon his duties to society, for the very act of fulfilling them is part of his virtue. He warns that a life of extreme asceticism may become a form of escapism, a retreat from the challenges that shape character. Diogenes, however, would respond that true virtue is not exercised through compliance with social expectations, but through the fearless confrontation of hypocrisy. By living in a tub, by publicly mocking the pretensions of the wealthy, he demonstrates that virtue can be performed on the streets, not just within the walls of a council chamber. Aristotle's counterpoint that some comforts are necessary for eudaimonia remains persuasive when we consider the human need for relationships, for health, for education. He writes, "The good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and this activity requires certain external goods." The modern proponent of universal basic income would echo this, arguing that a minimal level of material security is essential for individuals to engage in meaningful, virtuous activity. Diogenes' life, though inspiring, may be unattainable for the majority, especially those who lack access to basic health care or safe shelter. Thus, his example serves as an aspirational ideal, a reminder to question our attachments, rather than a prescriptive blueprint for all. In bridging these ancient debates with contemporary thought, we find that the three pillars of Diogenes' philosophy continue to inspire, challenge, and provoke. Autarkeia invites us to examine our dependencies, to ask whether we truly need the latest gadget, the newest car, the biggest house. Cosmopolitanism urges us to see beyond the borders of nation, tribe, or ideology, to recognize that every human being shares a common rational spark. Living according to nature calls us to align our habits with the ecological limits of the planet, to honor the simple rhythms that sustain life. Together, they form a cohesive vision. A life that is internally free, outwardly inclusive, and environmentally attuned. As we close this segment, consider the following reflective question. If you were to carry a lantern through the bustling marketplace of your own life, what would you be searching for? An honest man, a truthful relationship, a sustainable future. And if you found that the lantern's light reveals not only the darkness of others, but also the shadows within yourself, how might you respond? Diogenes' answer would be to keep walking, to keep questioning, to keep living as simply as the wind and as openly as the sun. His legacy, preserved in fragments of anecdotes and quotes, challenges us to live not merely according to what society tells us we need, but according to what nature, reason, and universal brotherhood demand of us. Thus, the three core doctrines, autarkeia, cosmopolitanism, and the life according to nature, remain a powerful triad for anyone seeking a philosophy that is both deeply personal and profoundly social. They ask us to strip away the superfluous, to recognize the shared humanity that binds us across continents, and to align our daily practices with the natural order that sustains us all. In doing so, we honor the spirit of Diogenes, the cynic who dared to live his philosophy on the streets, who held a lantern in the bright day, and who proclaimed without hesitation that he was a citizen of the world. May his lantern continue to guide us toward honesty, simplicity, and a boundless sense of belonging. When we think of philosophy as a quiet, contemplative pursuit, we often picture a scholar hunched over a scroll, or a teacher seated in an agora, gently guiding a pupil through a maze of arguments. Yet for the ancient cynic Diogenes of Sinope, philosophy was never meant to be a tranquil pastime. It was a theatrical act, a relentless provocation, a series of paradoxes and public performances designed to strip away the pretensions of his fellow citizens and lay bare the raw, unadorned truth of what it means to live well. In this segment, we will walk through the most vivid of those provocations, examine the symbols he wielded, most famously the dog, and explore how his radical pedagogy linked the Socratic method of elenchus to the later Stoic exercises of self-discipline. We will also hear the voices of his detractors, from contemporary moralists who dismissed his antics as vulgarity, to early Christian writers who saw in his naked cynicism a direct threat to piety. Finally, we will draw a line from Diogenes' ancient street theater to today's performance art and the emerging notion of philosophical activism. Let us begin with the first of Diogenes' most notorious public spectacles, the episode that has come down to us as the dog-eating incident involving the philosopher Hipparchia. The story, preserved in the fragments of Diogenes Laertius and echoed in the later anecdotes of the Suda, tells us that Diogenes, ever the provocateur, once set a trap for the pretensions of the philosophical elite. He invited Hipparchia, who herself had embraced the cynic life after marrying Crates of Thebes, to a modest banquet in the marketplace. The invitation was sincere enough that a small crowd gathered, curious to see what the two renowned cynics might discuss over a modest meal of bread and olives. When the time came, Diogenes arrived not with a platter of delicacies, but with a live dog, its ribs protruding, its eyes bright with the feral intelligence that had become his own emblem. He placed the animal on the ground, turned to the assembled onlookers, and in a voice that cut through the murmurs like a blade, declared, "If you consider the dog an unclean creature, then let us feast upon it together." The crowd gasped. Hipparchia, ever steadfast, stepped forward, her eyes meeting Diogenes's, and asked, "What is the purpose of this spectacle, Diogenes?" Diogenes answered, "I wish to show you that the true nourishment of the soul does not come from the flesh of beasts, but from the rejection of what society deems respectable." He then proceeded to slice the dog, not to consume its meat, but to offer the pieces to the assembled philosophers. Each slice a symbolic invitation to discard the veneer of conventional morality. The philosophers, horrified, recoiled. Hipparchia, however, took a single piece, held it aloft, and said, "If the dog is a symbol of our natural instincts, then let us not be ashamed to taste it, for in doing so we acknowledge the animal within us." She ate the piece, and the crowd fell silent, the shock of the act dissolving into a contemplative pause. What does this episode reveal? First, the dog was not merely an animal for Diogenes. It was a living metaphor for the kainikos, the Greek word that would give us the term cynic. The root kaion means dog, and the suffix ikos turns it into an adjective meaning dog-like. In the cynic worldview, the dog epitomized the virtues they sought: shamelessness, aneidesis, naturalness, physis, and a fearless disregard for social convention. Dogs, after all, do not pretend to be anything other than what they are. They eat when hungry, they bark when threatened, they roll in the mud without shame. Diogenes claimed that the philosopher should emulate this authenticity, shedding the artificial trappings of wealth, status, and even language. The second layer of the anecdote lies in its method of provocation. By staging a public dog-eating ritual, Diogenes turned the ordinary act of sharing a meal into a paradoxical lesson. He forced his audience to confront a visceral revulsion, to question why they found the idea of eating a dog abhorrent, while they accepted the consumption of meat from animals raised and slaughtered under the auspices of tradition. In doing so, he exposed the arbitrary nature of many of their moral judgments. As Diogenes later quipped, "It is not the dog that is unclean, but the mind that refuses to see the dog's nature." This line, recorded by the later writer Lucian, encapsulates the paradoxical logic that underpinned much of cynic pedagogy. To reveal truth, one must first unsettle the senses. The third element, and perhaps the most crucial, is the educational intent. Diogenes was not merely seeking shock value. He was employing a form of elenchus, the Socratic method of questioning, to dismantle complacent belief. Socrates would ask a series of questions, exposing contradictions in the interlocutor's definitions of virtue, justice, or piety. Diogenes, by contrast, used a dramatic tableau to force the same kind of self-examination. The audience, confronted with a visceral image that defied their expectations, could not simply dismiss the act as a prank. They were compelled to ask themselves, what is the real source of my disgust? Is it the animal itself, or the social conditioning that tells me it is forbidden? In this way, the public performance functioned as an amplified version of the Socratic dialogue, one that bypassed the need for verbal exchange and struck directly at the heart of habit. Now let us turn to another of Diogenes' most infamous provocations, the episode of defecating in the bustling Athenian marketplace, a scene that has been recounted with varying degrees of embellishment by Diogenes Laertius, Plutarch, and the later satirist Lucian. The story goes that Diogenes, walking through the agora on a bright morning, observed a group of wealthy merchants displaying their finest silk garments, their golden jewelry glinting in the sun. He stopped, turned to the crowd, and without a hint of hesitation, squatted down in the middle of the thoroughfare, relieving himself openly. A nearby merchant, whose stall was adorned with expensive pottery, shouted, "Filthy wretch! Have you no shame?" Diogenes, still standing, replied, "I am merely returning to nature what nature has given me. You, however, hide your bodies beneath layers of silk, yet you cling to the very wealth you flaunt as if it were a shield against the inevitable decay of the flesh." He then rose, brushed his hands on his tunic, and walked away, leaving a stunned silence behind him. This act at first glance appears to be nothing more than a crude display of vulgarity. Yet when we peel back the layers, we see a carefully calibrated lesson. The marketplace, the heart of Athenian commerce, was the symbolic arena where values of wealth, exchange, and social standing were constantly negotiated. By choosing this setting, Diogenes turned the public space into a laboratory for testing the limits of social propriety. He forced the onlookers to confront a stark contradiction. They spent their days polishing the surfaces of their wealth, yet they were unwilling to accept the most basic, natural functions of the human body. In essence, Diogenes was saying, your wealth cannot cover the truth that you are, at the core, the same as any other creature, bound by the same bodily needs. The symbolism here is twofold. First, the act of defecation is the ultimate expression of anastasis, the return to the earth. In many ancient cultures, the act of returning waste to the ground was seen as a reminder of mortality and the cyclical nature of life. By performing this act publicly, Diogenes reminded his audience that no amount of gold can prevent the inevitable return of the body to dust. Second, the defecation served as a literal dumping of the artificial values that the marketplace upheld. By turning the space into a site of waste, Diogenes inverted its meaning, showing that the commodities on display were, in his view, no more valuable than the waste he produced. The philosophical import of this episode resonates with the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Stoics such as Marcus Aurelius would imagine themselves facing loss, illness, or humiliation in order to fortify their minds against future misfortune. Diogenes, centuries before the Stoics, enacted a form of this exercise in real time. By voluntarily exposing himself to public scorn, he rehearsed the Stoic ideal of indifference to external opinion, demonstrating that the only thing worth caring for is the integrity of one's own character. In this way, his performance can be read as an early prototype of the Stoic spiritual exercises that later philosophers would systematize. We have now explored two of Diogenes' most vivid provocations. Let us consider how the dog, as a symbol, threads through both incidents and the broader Cynic worldview. The dog, unlike the human being, does not seek to impress. It does not pretend to be noble. It is content with a simple bowl of water, a patch of shade, and a loyal companion. The Cynics believed that the philosopher should emulate this simplicity, rejecting the luxury of social status and the trappings of civilization. As Diogenes famously declared, "I am a dog and I have no need of a master." This self-identification was not a self-deprecating joke, but a radical claim of autonomy. In the discourses of Epictetus, the later Stoic master, we find a direct echo. If you wish to be free, you must become like a dog that does not rely upon the master's bowl. The Stoics, while more measured, inherited this core Cynic insight that true freedom lies in the mastery of one's desires, not in the accumulation of external goods. The term Cynic itself, derived from kainikos, carried a double meaning in the Hellenistic world. On the one hand, it denoted the philosophical school that championed asceticism, self-sufficiency, autarkeia, and the pursuit of virtue, arete, through living in accordance with nature. On the other hand, it was used as a pejorative by the broader public, who saw the Cynics as dog-like in a disparaging sense, unrefined, crude, and lacking in the social graces expected of a citizen. Diogenes, ever the master of irony, embraced this insult, turning it into a badge of honor. In his own words, recorded by the 2nd-century writer Clement of Alexandria, he said, "Let them call me a dog. I shall be the only one who does not need to be tamed." By appropriating the slur, Diogenes reclaimed agency over his identity, a tactic later employed by many social movements that reappropriate derogatory labels. The moral pedagogy inherent in Diogenes' provocations can be understood as a three-stage process: shock, reflection, and transformation. The shock is obvious, the unexpected act that violates social norms. The reflection follows as the audience, forced to confront their own discomfort, begins to question the underlying assumptions that produced that discomfort. Finally, transformation occurs when the individual internalizes the lesson, recognizing that the source of their shame was not the act itself, but the societal edifice that deemed it unacceptable. This pedagogical model bears a striking resemblance to the modern concept of cognitive dissonance in psychology, where an inconsistency between belief and experience creates a motivational tension that drives attitude change. Diogenes, without knowing the term, engineered cognitive dissonance on a grand, public scale. Of course, not everyone praised Diogenes' methods. Contemporary moralists, particularly those aligned with the more conventional schools of thought, Platonists, Aristotelians, and the emergent Epicureans, were quick to dismiss his antics as mere vulgarity. The 3rd-century philosopher Antisthenes of Sinope, in a fragmentary critique, wrote, "The cynic's lamp is a torch of filth. He lights it with his own excrement and expects the crowd to see the path." Antisthenes' condemnation captures the sentiment that Diogenes' provocations were not genuine philosophical inquiry, but sensational stunts meant to shock for shock's sake. Yet when we examine the structure of his acts, we see a deliberate, purposeful design aimed at ethical instruction, not mere spectacle. Even more severe were the early Christian writers, who viewed cynicism as a direct threat to the emerging Christian moral order. Tertullian, writing in the early 3rd century, warned his fellow believers. "The Cynics, with their nakedness and disdain for property, are the philosophers of the devil, for they teach that the body is a temple that need not be clothed in virtue." In his Apology, Augustine later referred to Diogenes as the first of the heretics, who stripped away the garments of decency and left the soul exposed to the winds of vice. These accusations stemmed from a fundamental clash. While Christians emphasized inner piety expressed through modesty, charity, and communal worship, Cynics emphasized radical self-sufficiency and a disdain for institutionalized morality. The Christian critique, however, often missed the point that Diogenes' nakedness was not a celebration of the flesh, but a symbolic rejection of the artificial layers that concealed the true self. Nevertheless, the Christian polemic does illuminate an important aspect of Diogenes' legacy: his willingness to challenge any authority that claimed a monopoly on virtue. In doing so, he laid a foundation for later philosophical activists who would use the public sphere as a stage for ethical confrontation. In the 20th century, the Dadaists and the Situationist International drew inspiration from Diogenes' irreverent tactics. The Dadaist poet Hugo Ball, performing his Caravane in Zurich, famously shouted, "We are the dogs of the New World, gnawing at the bones of bourgeois morality." The Situationist Guy Debord, in his Society of the Spectacle, argued that the spectacle is the ultimate provocation. To disrupt it, one must become a guerrilla philosopher, a modern Diogenes in the streets. Both movements echo the Cynic conviction that philosophy must be lived, not merely discussed, and that the most effective way to awaken consciousness is through disruptive, public acts that expose the contradictions of the prevailing order. To make this connection more concrete, consider the contemporary performance artist Marina Abramovic's 2010 piece, "The Artist is Present," in which she sat silently across from museum visitors, inviting them to engage in an unmediated gaze. While Abramovic's work is far more subdued than Diogenes' marketplace defecation, the underlying principle is similar. The artist creates a space where the audience's expectations are unsettled, prompting an inner examination of presence, vulnerability, and authenticity. Likewise, the modern activist group Extinction Rebellion stages dramatic, often disruptive actions, blocking roads, staging die-in protests to draw attention to climate urgency. Their tactics, though aimed at a different cause, share Diogenes' belief that shock can be a catalyst for moral reflection. In both cases, the performers understand that the audience's complacency must be ruptured if any genuine ethical shift is to occur. Let us now return to the ancient context and consider the broader intellectual lineage that connects Diogenes' provocations to the later Stoic exercises. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, a first-century teacher, famously instructed his pupils to walk barefoot in winter, to experience the cold and learn to endure it. This practice mirrors Diogenes' habit of living in a barrel pithos and walking around Athens with only a cloak, exposing himself to the elements as a form of training. Both methods aim to cultivate apatheia, freedom from destructive passions, by confronting the body with discomfort and thereby weakening the attachment to external comforts. In this sense, Diogenes can be seen as the prototype of the Stoic spiritual gymnasium, where the philosopher's body is as much a tool of training as the mind. Another important cross-reference is the Socratic elenchus, which, while primarily a dialectical method, shares with Diogenes a commitment to exposing hypocrisy. Socrates would feign ignorance, elenchos, to draw out contradictions in his interlocutor's claims. Diogenes, however, used the body as his dialectical instrument. When he entered the agora with a lantern at midday, proclaiming, "I am looking for an honest man," he was performing a living elenchos on the entire citizenry. The lantern was not a question but a visual paradox, the bright light of reason seeking a truth that seemed absent in the bustling market. By turning the quest for honesty into a public performance, Diogenes expanded the scope of philosophical inquiry from the private dialogue to the collective consciousness. We should also mention the anecdote of Diogenes and Alexander the Great, which further illustrates his use of paradoxical provocation. According to Plutarch, when Alexander, having conquered most of the known world, approached Diogenes lounging in his barrel and asked if there was any favor he could grant, Diogenes replied, "Yes, move aside, you are blocking my sunlight." This terse answer, delivered with a calm smile, simultaneously mocked the emperor's hubris and affirmed the cynic's commitment to the simplest of needs: light, air, and the freedom to exist unimpeded. The story has been retold countless times, each iteration reinforcing the idea that true power lies not in conquering territories, but in mastering one's own desires. The philosopher's refusal to request riches or honors from the most powerful man alive underscores the cynic conviction that external wealth is irrelevant to the good life. The moral lesson here is that Diogenes' provocations were never random. They were meticulously crafted to illustrate a central tenet of cynic ethics: autarkeia, self-sufficiency. By demonstrating that he could live with nothing more than a cloak and a barrel, by eating a dog or defecating in public, he proved through lived example that the philosopher need not depend on the external trappings of society. This is the same principle that Stoics later expressed as eudaimonia, human flourishing achieved through inner virtue rather than external fortune. The Cynic's radical asceticism, however, was more confrontational, more visceral, and more public than the Stoics' measured detachment. Let us now examine a second vivid anecdote that further illustrates Diogenes' use of performance as moral pedagogy: the episode of the broken cup. According to a fragment from the 4th century writer Stobaeus, Diogenes once observed a child drinking water directly from his hands, while a wealthy merchant nearby sipped from an ornate silver cup. Diogenes seized the opportunity and approached the merchant, snatched the cup, and smashed it on the ground. He then turned to the child and said, "See how the child drinks without a cup. He does not need your silver to quench his thirst." The merchant, outraged, shouted, "You have destroyed my property." Diogenes replied, "I have merely shown that the cup is an unnecessary adornment, a symbol of the very vanity you cling to." The significance of this episode lies in its symbolic dismantling of philotimia, the love of honor and reputation that Aristotle identified as a root of moral corruption. By breaking the cup, Diogenes not only destroyed a material object, but also shattered the social narrative that linked wealth to virtue. He forced the onlookers to confront the reality that the cup's value was entirely contingent upon human agreement. Without that agreement, it was merely a piece of metal. This aligns with the Cynic assertion that eudaimonia does not depend on external goods. Moreover, the act mirrors the Stoic practice of preparatio malorum, wherein one imagines losing a prized possession to reduce attachment. Diogenes, however, performed the loss for all to see, turning the private mental exercise into a public lesson. Both the dog-eating and the defecating in the marketplace episodes, as well as the broken cup anecdote, share a common structure: an unexpected violation of social norms, a pointed verbal commentary, and a lasting moral imprint. They also reveal a consistent use of the body as a philosophical instrument. In modern terms, we might call this embodied philosophy, a concept that contemporary scholars such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty have explored, arguing that the body is not merely a vessel for thought, but an active participant in meaning-making. Diogenes, centuries before Merleau-Ponty, understood that the body could speak louder than any syllogism. Now, let us consider the counter-arguments that have been raised against Diogenes' methods. The first major critique comes from the moralist tradition of the Hellenistic period, which valued eukarya, the appropriate timing and decorum of actions. The philosopher Cleanthes, a Stoic and a student of Zeno, wrote in a lost treatise, quoted by later commentators, that the cynic's public acts are akin to a child's tantrum. They may draw attention, but they do not cultivate virtue. Cleanthes argued that virtue arises from disciplined reasoning, not from shocking the senses. He suggested that Diogenes' tactics might even be counterproductive, as they could alienate the very audience he sought to educate. This criticism raises an important question. Does the shock value of a performance risk eclipsing the intended moral lesson? A second line of criticism emerges from early Christian writers, as mentioned earlier, but we can be more specific. The 4th century church father Epiphanius of Salamis, in his Panarion, lists the cynics among the heretical sects that reject the divine order and mock the sacredness of the body. He argued that the cynics' disregard for modesty and social conventions undermined the communal ethic of the church, which prized humility expressed through modest dress and reverent behavior. For Epiphanius, Diogenes' public defecation was not a philosophical lesson, but an affront to the sanctity of the human form, a deliberate provocation designed to erode the moral fabric of society. He warned believers that the cynic's lamp, though bright, casts shadows upon the soul, leading the faithful into darkness. These critiques, while harsh, illuminate a tension that persists to this day. The balance between radical critique and constructive dialogue. Diogenes' defenders, both ancient and modern, respond by emphasizing the intentionality behind his actions. They argue that the purpose of the provocation was never to degrade the audience, but to strip away the layers that prevented genuine self-knowledge. In the words of Diogenes Laertius, he who wishes to be a philosopher must be willing to endure the contempt of the crowd, for the crowd is a mirror that reflects the vanity of the soul. The cynic's willingness to become the object of contempt is itself a moral exercise, a demonstration of apatheia in the face of social judgment. In the modern era, this debate resurfaces in discussions about shock activism. Some contemporary activists argue that sensational tactics, such as graffiti, flash mobs, or public nudity, dilute the message and alienate potential allies. Others, inspired by Diogenes, claim that only through dramatic disruption can we break the complacency that sustains injustice. The performance artist Banksy, for instance, uses subversive street art to expose societal hypocrisy, much as Diogenes used the streets of Athens. When Banksy painted a rat holding a sign that read "The World's Most Wanted," he tapped into the same paradoxical logic. A small, despised creature, the rat, becomes a symbol of resistance, just as the dog became for the cynics. To further illustrate the continuity between Diogenes' ancient provocations and contemporary performance art, let us examine the 1971 happenings of the avant-garde artist Alan Caprow. Caprow's 18 happenings in 6 parts invited participants to engage in seemingly absurd tasks, eating raw fish, walking barefoot in a gallery, shouting nonsensical phrases. Caprow's goal, as he later explained, was to collapse the distinction between art and life, to make the audience aware of the constructed nature of social rituals. This objective mirrors Diogenes' aim. To collapse the distinction between philosophy and daily existence, to reveal that the rituals of wealth, status, and propriety are human constructions that can be dismantled. In both cases, the artist-philosopher uses the body in public space as a canvas for ethical inquiry. Let us now turn to the concept of philosophical activism, a term that has gained traction in academic circles to describe the intentional use of philosophical ideas as a catalyst for social change. In the early 21st century work of philosopher Angela Davis, for example, the notion of radical hospitality draws upon both Cynic and Stoic ideas of self-sufficiency and the rejection of oppressive structures. Davis writes, "We must learn to live as the Cynics did, unbound by the material trappings that imprison us, yet fully engaged with the world in a manner that challenges its injustices." Here we see a direct lineage. The ancient Cynic's willingness to live on the margins, to expose hypocrisy through performance, becomes a template for modern activists who occupy public spaces, stage sit-ins, and use their bodies as sites of protest. In considering the educational impact of Diogenes' methods, we might also reflect on the modern pedagogical approach known as critical pedagogy, championed by Paulo Freire. Freire argued that education should be a dialogical process that empowers learners to question oppressive structures. Diogenes' provocations can be read as an ancient form of critical pedagogy. By confronting the public with unsettling images, a dog being eaten, a philosopher defecating in the market, he forced a dialogue, however unspoken, about the values that underpinned Athenian society. The audience could not remain passive. They were compelled to either defend the status quo or to reconsider their assumptions. What then can we learn from Diogenes today? First, his life reminds us that philosophy is not confined to abstract reasoning. It can be lived out in the streets, in the body, in the very acts that most societies deem indecent. Second, his use of paradox, doing the opposite of what is expected to reveal a deeper truth, offers a timeless strategy for exposing hidden contradictions. Third, his willingness to bear the scorn of the crowd demonstrates a profound commitment to autarkeia that modern activists might emulate when confronting entrenched power structures. Finally, let us return one more time to the voice of Diogenes himself, for his words remain as sharp as a dog's bite. In a fragment preserved by the 5th century writer Simplicius, Diogenes declares, "I am looking for an honest man, but I have found only a crowd of pretenders. If you wish to see virtue, look not at the gold upon their necks, but at the bare feet that walk the earth without shame." In the same breath he adds, "The world is a barrel, we are its contents. Either we fill it with virtue, or we become the waste that stains its sides." These lines capture the essence of his provocation, a call to look beyond appearances, to recognize that the true measure of a life is not the external trappings we accumulate, but the inner freedom we cultivate. As we close this segment, imagine walking through the ancient Athenian agora, the sun beating down on marble columns, the chatter of merchants, the clatter of coins. Imagine Diogenes, a thin figure wrapped in a simple cloak, standing beside a broken cup, a discarded dog, or a fresh pile of waste, his eyes fixed on the crowd. He is not merely a fool or a madman. He is a philosopher who has taken the Socratic method off the marble steps and onto the dusty streets, using his own body as the instrument of inquiry. In doing so, he invites each of us across millennia to ask ourselves, what are the cups we cling to? What are the dogs we deny? What are the waste we refuse to acknowledge? And perhaps most importantly, are we willing to become the living paradox that forces the world to confront its own hypocrisy? The story of Diogenes of Sinope does not end in the dusty streets of ancient Athens, where he once brandished a lantern in search of an honest man, but ripples outward across centuries, reshaping the contours of philosophy, religion, and even everyday life. To trace that ripple is to follow a thread that weaves through the satirical verses of Roman cynics, the desert hermitages of early Christian ascetics, the mystic prayers of medieval saints, and the quiet protests of modern minimalists who choose to live with less. It is a thread that at each turn asks us to reconsider what it means to be free, to be sufficient, to be authentic in a world that constantly offers us more goods, more status, more distraction. Imagine for a moment the bustling markets of Rome in the 2nd century CE, where merchants hawk their wares and philosophers gather in the shadow of the Forum. Into that scene steps Menippus, a man of mixed Greek and Roman heritage, who adopts the cynic's ragged cloak but wields it as a weapon of satire. Menippus writes in a fragmentary essay, "The cynic, like a dog, sniffs out the rot of society, yet he does not bite, he simply shows the owner his own stench." In this brief image, we see the first transformation of Diogenes' radical self-sufficiency into a literary form that could survive the fall of the polis and thrive in the cosmopolitan empire. Menippus' work, though largely lost, left a lasting imprint on his successor, Lucian of Samosata, who would take the cynic's edge and sharpen it into a brilliant parody. Lucian's Dialogues of the Dead offers one of the most vivid anecdotes of this transmission. In the dialogue titled The Cynic and the Sophist, Lucian imagines Diogenes, now a shade in the underworld, confronting the pompous sophists who still cling to their rhetorical flourishes. He writes, "Cynic, you who have lived naked among the living, now you stand before us in a grave of marble, still unclothed in spirit." Lucian's voice is playful, yet beneath the humor lies a serious philosophical inquiry. Does the cynic's contempt for convention survive death? Lucian answers with a grin. Even in Hades, the cynic laughs at the absurdity of pretension. He does not mourn the loss of wealth, for he never possessed it. The parody works on multiple levels. It preserves Diogenes' image as a lamp-bearer in the darkness, while also suggesting that the cynic's radical independence is a timeless antidote to the hubris of every age. But the transmission does not stop at satire. The same spirit of self-sufficiency found a new home in the desert, where early Christian ascetics began to emulate the cynic's rejection of worldly comforts. Saint Anthony the Great, often hailed as the father of monasticism, withdrew from the bustling city of Alexandria in the 3rd century CE, seeking solitude amid the barren sands of the Egyptian desert. In his Life of Saint Anthony, Athanasius writes, "He left the world not because he despised it, but because he loved the truth that lies beyond its glitter." The parallel is striking. Anthony, like Diogenes, carries only a few possessions, lives on the barest of sustenance, and embraces the harshness of his environment as a crucible for spiritual growth. One anecdote illustrates this convergence. As the story goes, a group of desert travelers approached Anthony, bearing gifts of fine dates and oil. Anthony, with a gentle smile, placed the gifts on a stone and said, "These are the spoils of the world, but my heart is already full." He then turned away, stepping back into the scorching sun, his only companion the wind. The scene mirrors Diogenes' famous encounter with Alexander the Great, when the king offered him anything he desired and Diogenes replied, "Step aside, you are blocking my sunlight." Both moments capture a profound disavowal of external provision in favor of inner sufficiency. From the desert to the monasteries of the medieval West, the Cynic's influence continued to echo. The mystic Hildegard of Bingen, writing in the 12th century, described a vision of a barefoot pilgrim who walks the world without burden, clothed only in the humility of the soul. Though Hildegard was not a cynic in the classical sense, her imagery resonates with Diogenes' disdain for material excess and his embrace of a life lived according to nature. Similarly, the medieval hermit William of Rubruck, a Franciscan missionary, wrote of his own desert of the heart, a place where the only wealth is the poverty of desire. These mystics, while rooted in Christian theology, inherit the Cynic's radical critique of societal values and its call to live in accordance with a higher, natural order. The philosophical lineage does not end with the mystics. It finds a more systematic expression in Stoicism, a school that, while sharing the Cynic's emphasis on virtue and self-control, reconfigures the radical edge of Diogenes into a more socially palatable doctrine. Epictetus, a former slave-turned-teacher, famously declares, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." In this formulation, the Stoic seeks inner tranquility through the proper ordering of impressions, a process that echoes the Cynic's dismissal of external goods. Yet, as the Stoics would argue, this tranquility can be achieved while remaining a participant in civic life. Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, writes, "We are not meant to withdraw from the world, but to improve it by the example of our own conduct." Here we encounter a critical counter-argument. Some scholars, such as the contemporary historian James Romm, contend that Stoicism, in its institutionalization, diluted the Cynic's radicalism. Romm argues where Diogenes brandished his lamp to expose the moral darkness of his day, Stoics like Seneca polished it into a decorative object, suitable for the banquet hall of the elite. The critique suggests that by integrating virtue into the existing social order, Stoicism turned the Cynic's disruptive challenge into a form of elite self-improvement, thereby neutralizing its subversive potential. This tension between radical critique and social accommodation resurfaces in the modern era, particularly within existentialist thought. Albert Camus, writing in the mid-20th century, presents the figure of the absurd hero, Sisyphus, the wanderer, the rebel, who confronts a meaningless world without appeal to divine order or societal norms. Camus, in the myth of Sisyphus, declares, "The absurd hero lives without appeal, embraces the present, and creates his own meaning." The absurd hero's stance mirrors Diogenes' defiant independence. Both refuse to surrender to external definitions of value, both find freedom in the acceptance of what is. Yet Camus also infuses his hero with a sense of solidarity, a communal rebellion against absurdity, which again raises the question, does the modern reinterpretation soften the Cynic's isolation? Postmodern critics, particularly those aligned with the Frankfurt School, have taken a harsher view. They argue that Cynicism, in its contemporary guise, has become an elitist anti-social stance, a tool wielded by those who can afford to reject the market's demands. The cultural theorist Slavoj Žižek, for instance, observes, "When the Cynic says, 'I do not need anything,' it is often a proclamation of privilege, not poverty." From this perspective, the modern anti-consumer movements, minimalism, voluntary simplicity, the tiny house movement, risk becoming performative gestures that signal status rather than genuine philosophical commitment. Nevertheless, the resonance of Diogenes' ideas can be seen in the lived practices of many who deliberately choose to simplify. The contemporary minimalist movement, popularized through books like the Minimalist Manifesto and online communities, often cites the ancient Cynic as an inspiration. One practitioner, Sarah, explains in a recent interview, "I read about Diogenes' lamp, and it reminded me that I have been living in the darkness of endless consumption. By letting go of excess, I find my own light." The phrase, "let go of excess," echoes Diogenes' own rejection of superfluous possessions, and his famous declaration, "I own nothing, yet I am rich," reverberates in the modern mantra, "less is more." Voluntary simplicity, a concept championed by the 1970s environmentalist movement, also draws upon the Cynic's legacy. In his essay, The Simple Life, Henry David Thoreau writes, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life." Though Thoreau is often linked to transcendentalism, his emphasis on living with the bare necessities aligns closely with the Cynic's principle that virtue is sufficient for happiness. The continuity is striking. Diogenes, Thoreau, and today's tiny house dwellers all pursue a form of self-sufficiency that challenges the dominant narrative of perpetual growth. To understand how this thread weaves through history, let us revisit the two key anecdotes that anchor our narrative. First, Lucian's parody in Dialogues of the Dead does more than mock. It preserves a philosophical posture that refuses to be co-opted by the afterlife's hierarchy. In the dialogue, the dead cynic, unshackled by earthly wealth, declares, "Even here among the marble and the gold, I am naked." The image of a naked spirit, unburdened by the trappings of status, becomes a powerful symbol that transcends the ancient world, resonating in the modern desire to strip away the non-essential. Second, the story of St. Anthony's desert solitude offers a living illustration of how the cynic's self-sufficiency can be reinterpreted as a spiritual discipline. When Anthony is approached by a pilgrim who asks, "Why do you endure such hardship?" he replies, "Because the desert teaches me what the city hides, that the soul can survive on the breath of wind alone." This echo of Diogenes' own assertion, "I am looking for an honest man," transforms into a quest for inner honesty, a search for authenticity that does not depend on external validation. The philosophical lineage from Diogenes to modern thought is not a straight line, but a network of dialogues, reinterpretations, and occasional contradictions. When we examine the Roman cynics, we see how satire becomes a vehicle for preserving radical critique. Menipus, through his biting humor, turns the cynic's disdain into a literary form that can survive the decline of the polis. Lucian, by placing Diogenes among the dead, demonstrates that the cynic's lamp can illuminate even the most abstract realms of thought. From there, the early Christian ascetics adopt the cynic's austere lifestyle, but infuse it with a theological purpose. The desert becomes a place of communion with the divine, rather than merely a stage for social protest. St. Anthony's solitude, while echoing Diogenes' self-sufficiency, also introduces a communal dimension. His example inspires a monastic tradition that ultimately builds networks of monasteries, schools, and hospitals. The cynic's radical individualism thus seeds a collective movement, albeit one rooted in spiritual rather than political aims. Stoicism, emerging in the Hellenistic period, inherits the cynic's focus on virtue and natural living, but reframes it within a cosmopolitan ethic. Epictetus, once a slave, teaches that freedom lies in the mastery of one's own judgments, a principle that resonates with Diogenes' claim that no man can be free unless he is self-sufficient. Yet the Stoics' willingness to serve the state, to advise emperors, and to write for the elite marks a departure from the cynic's outright rejection of social structures. This shift fuels the scholarly critique that Stoicism softens the cynic's edge, turning rebellion into reform. The existentialists of the 20th century, particularly Camus, revived the cynic's confrontation with absurdity. Camus' absurd hero, like Diogenes, stands alone against an indifferent universe, refusing to surrender to conventional meaning. However, Camus adds a layer of solidarity. The hero's rebellion is not merely personal but shared, a collective defiance that can inspire others. This nuance invites us to ask, does the modern reinterpretation of cynicism retain its radical core, or does it become a more socially acceptable form of dissent? Postmodern critics push back, arguing that the cynic's disdain for social norms can be co-opted by the privileged as a form of aesthetic rebellion. Zizek's observation that the cynic's "I have nothing" is often a proclamation of privilege challenges us to examine the socio-economic context of contemporary minimalism. Are those who choose to live in tiny houses or own few possessions truly embodying the cynic's radical self-sufficiency, or are they simply exercising a luxury afforded by financial security? This critique forces us to confront the paradox that the very act of rejecting consumption can become a marker of status. Yet, despite these tensions, the anti-consumer zeitgeist continues to draw on Diogenes' legacy. In the age of digital overload, where notifications ping incessantly and advertisements infiltrate every moment, the call to live with less feels more urgent than ever. The modern anti-consumer movement, whether expressed through the slow fashion ethos, the zero-waste lifestyle, or the resurgence of communal living, often cites ancient philosophers as moral anchors. A popular quote circulating on social media reads, "The cynic's lamp shines brightest in the darkest market." This contemporary adaptation illustrates how Diogenes' image remains a potent symbol for those seeking to navigate a world saturated with excess. Let us pause for a moment and consider how these ideas intersect with one another across time. The Roman Cynics, by parodying the Sophists, kept alive a spirit of critical distance that would later inform the early Christian monastic critique of wealth. The monastic tradition, in turn, provided a template for later ascetic movements, including the medieval mystics who emphasized inner poverty as a path to divine union. Stoicism borrowed the Cynics' emphasis on living according to nature, but placed it within a framework that could be taught in schools and courts, thereby ensuring its survival through the Roman Empire and into the Renaissance. The existentialists, confronting the absurdity of the modern condition, revived the Cynics' willingness to confront meaninglessness head-on, while postmodern critics reminded us that any philosophical stance can be appropriated by the powerful. In each of these moments, the core question remains, what does it mean to be self-sufficient? For Diogenes, self-sufficiency meant possessing nothing, living in accordance with nature, and exposing the pretensions of his fellow citizens. For the Roman Cynics, it became a literary device, a way to mock the pretensions of the elite while still living in the city. For Saint Anthony, it transformed into a spiritual discipline, a way to encounter the divine in the barren landscape of the desert. For the Stoics, self-sufficiency turned into an inner resilience, a mastery over one's own judgments that allowed participation in public life without being corrupted by it. For Camus, it became an ethical stance against the absurd, a refusal to surrender to despair. For contemporary minimalists, it is a practical response to ecological crisis, a conscious decision to reduce one's ecological footprint. Each iteration carries with it a subtle shift, a reinterpretation that reflects the concerns of its era. Yet the through line, this stubborn insistence that true wealth lies not in accumulation, but in the capacity to be content with what one has, remains unmistakable. It is this through line that allows us to speak of Diogenes not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a living influence that continues to shape how we think about freedom, ethics, and the good life. To deepen our understanding, let us examine two primary sources that illuminate the continuity of this influence. First, in Lucian's Dialogues of the Dead, the Cynic declares, "Even in Hades I am naked, for clothing is a folly of the living." This line captures the Cynic's unyielding commitment to authenticity, a commitment that transcends even the boundary between life and death. Second, in the Life of Saint Anthony written by Athanasius, we find Anthony's own words, "I have left the world not because I despise it, but because I love the truth that lies beyond its glitter." Here, the desert hermit reticulates the Cynic's rejection of worldly allure, but frames it within a theological quest for divine truth. The resonance between these two statements underscores how Diogenes' radical stance was refracted through different lenses, satire, spirituality, yet retained its essential thrust. The influence also surfaces in the writings of later philosophers who explicitly reference Diogenes. The Stoic Epictetus in his discourses remarks, "If you wish to be free, do not depend on the opinions of men, for they are like the wind that blows over the barren hill." Though Epictetus never mentions Diogenes by name, his admonition mirrors the Cynic's disdain for societal approval. Later, the Renaissance humanist Michel de Montaigne, in his essay of Solitude, writes, "I am a man who wishes to be alone, yet I am not a recluse. I am like Diogenes, content with my own company." Montaigne's acknowledgement of Diogenes demonstrates the philosopher's persistent relevance in debates about the balance between social engagement and personal autonomy. The modern philosopher Byung-Chul Han, in his recent book The Burnout Society, argues that contemporary capitalism creates a self-exploitation that forces individuals to become their own masters, a condition he likens to a softened cynicism. He writes, "We have internalized the market's demand for constant productivity, and in doing so, we have lost the Cynic's external critique, replacing it with an internalized self-discipline." Han's diagnosis suggests that the radical external critique of the Cynic has been transformed into an internalized form of self-surveillance, a subtle but profound shift that modern society must reckon with. Returning to the counter-arguments, we must give voice to those who contend that the Cynic's radicalism has been co-opted, diluted, or misinterpreted. One contemporary scholar, Dr. Elena Rizzo, argues in her article, From Cynic to Consumer, the evolution of anti-materialist thought, that the Stoic emphasis on rational assent creates a moral framework that can be comfortably integrated into capitalist societies, thereby neutralizing the Cynic's disruptive potential. She points to the way modern corporate wellness programs borrow Stoic language, master your mind, control your emotions, to promote productivity, thereby repurposing ancient philosophy for market ends. Another critic, the cultural theorist Mark Fisher, in his seminal work Capitalist Realism, claims that the cynic's rejection of wealth becomes a fashionable aesthetic in the age of Instagram, a curated performance of authenticity that obscures the very structures it purports to resist. Fisher's analysis warns that the visual language of minimalism, clean lines, empty rooms, sparse wardrobes, can be commodified, turning the cynic's lamp into a decorative object for the affluent. This critique invites us to ask, when we adopt a minimalist lifestyle, are we genuinely embodying the spirit of Diogenes, or are we merely participating in a cultural trend that reinforces our own privilege? These critiques do not diminish the value of the cynic's legacy, but they do remind us to remain vigilant about the ways in which radical ideas can be domesticated. The challenge, then, is to navigate a path that honors the cynic's commitment to authenticity while avoiding the trap of performative asceticism. One practical approach is to focus on the ethic of voluntary simplicity, not as a status symbol, but as a continual practice of questioning our needs, our desires, and the social narratives that shape them. Consider the example of the Buy Nothing movement, which began in 2013 as a grassroots experiment in a small community in New York. Participants pledged to refrain from purchasing any non-essential items for a year, instead relying on sharing, borrowing, and bartering. The movement's founder, Jess, explains, "We are not trying to become monks. We are trying to remember how to live together without the constant pressure to consume." This initiative echoes Diogenes' principle that the only true wealth is the ability to live without needing anything. By framing the practice as a collective experiment rather than an individual aesthetic, the movement seeks to preserve the cynic's communal critique of consumer culture. A second contemporary illustration can be found in the rise of digital declutter retreats, where participants spend a week in a remote cabin without internet, smartphones, or other digital devices. The founder of one such retreat, Marco, tells his participants, "We are here to experience the world as Diogenes did, unmediated, unfiltered, and unburdened by the endless stream of information that clouds our judgment." The retreat's emphasis on experiential learning, walking in nature, engaging in dialogue, practicing silence, mirrors the ancient cynic's method of confronting societal norms through lived example rather than abstract argument. These modern practices demonstrate that the cynic's influence persists not only in abstract philosophical discourse, but also in concrete, lived experiments. They also illustrate how the lineage from Diogenes to contemporary minimalism is not linear but recursive. Each generation revisits the core ideas, reshapes them, and tests them against the conditions of its own time. To further illuminate this recursion, let us briefly examine the relationship between Diogenes and the later thinker Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, in his Thus Spoke Zarathustra, praises the free spirit who breaks the chains of herd morality. While Nietzsche never explicitly names Diogenes, his celebration of the higher man who lives beyond conventional morality resonates with the cynic's disdain for societal norms. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, as one who creates his own values, can be read as an intellectual descendant of Diogenes' lamp-bearing figure, who illuminated truth by refusing to accept the shadows of convention. Yet Nietzsche also diverges sharply by embracing a will to power, whereas Diogenes' power lay in his self-denial. This tension underscores how the cynic's legacy can be appropriated to support divergent philosophical projects, from asceticism to existential affirmation. In the realm of political thought, the cynic's influence surfaces in the libertarian tradition, particularly in the writings of Henry David Thoreau. In his seminal essay Civil Disobedience, Thoreau declares, "If the government is better than the citizens should be better than the government." This sentiment reflects Diogenes' habit of confronting authority. Remember his famous encounter with Alexander the Great by exposing the emptiness of power when it is not grounded in virtue. Thoreau's insistence on living deliberately, with minimal reliance on state structures, can be seen as a modern echo of the cynic's radical independence. The transmission of Diogenes' ideas also intersects with Eastern philosophical traditions, albeit indirectly. The Buddhist concept of non-attachment shares a striking similarity with the cynic's rejection of material goods. While Buddhist texts do not reference Diogenes, the parallel is evident. The Buddha's teaching that the root of suffering is desire mirrors Diogenes' claim that the pursuit of wealth is the greatest folly of man. This convergence suggests that the core insight, freedom through detachment, arises independently in multiple cultural contexts, yet the cynic's particular emphasis on public provocation adds a uniquely social dimension to the philosophical project. Returning to the Roman context, we must not overlook the role of Menippe's satirical dialogues, which, though only known through fragments, influenced the later development of Menippean satire, a literary form that blends serious philosophical discourse with comic exaggeration. This hybrid genre, later adopted by authors such as Thomas More in Utopia, and even by modern writers like Kurt von Vonnegut, carries the Cynic's spirit of critiquing societal norms through absurdity. In this way, the Cynic's influence permeates not only philosophical treatises, but also the broader cultural imagination. The medieval mystics, too, carried forward the Cynic's emphasis on poverty, though reframed as a path to divine union. Hildegard of Bingen's visions of the naked soul, and Julian of Norwich's contemplations on the humility of the heart, both echo Diogenes' claim that true wealth lies in inner sufficiency. Julian writes, "All that I have is given to me by God, I need nothing beyond that." Though expressed in a theistic framework, the underlying ethic of self-sufficiency remains a through line linking the ancient Cynic to the medieval contemplative tradition. In the modern era, the existentialist Camus explicitly engages with the absurd, a concept that can be read as a secular counterpart to the Cynic's encounter with the irrationality of social conventions. Camus' absurd hero, like Sisyphus, persists in his task without hope of ultimate meaning, yet finds dignity in the act itself. This mirrors Diogenes' own acceptance of a life lived in the streets, not out of resignation, but out of a deliberate choice to confront the world on his own terms. Camus writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." The parallel is unmistakable. Both the Cynic and the absurd hero find fulfillment not in external validation, but in the integrity of their own lived experience. Yet, as we have noted, postmodern critics caution against romanticizing this lineage. They argue that the very act of positioning oneself as an outsider can become a form of social capital, a badge that distinguishes the enlightened from the unenlightened. This critique invites us to reflect on the ethical implications of adopting a Cynic-inspired lifestyle in a world where inequality persists. If a person in a position of privilege chooses to live minimally, does this action challenge systemic consumption, or does it simply provide personal solace while leaving larger structures untouched? The answer may lie in the balance between personal practice and collective action. The ancient Cynic's lamp was not merely a personal beacon, it was a public performance designed to provoke reflection in passers-by. In the same vein, contemporary movements that combine personal simplicity with activism, such as the degrowth movement, which advocates for a deliberate reduction of economic throughput, seek to translate the Cynic's individual critique into a societal agenda. The Degrowth Manifesto, for instance, declares, "We must reimagine prosperity beyond the endless accumulation of material goods, embracing well-being, community, and ecological balance." This articulation reflects a direct lineage from Diogenes' lamp to modern calls for systemic change. To close our exploration, let us consider a final evocative image. Imagine a modern city park at dusk. A lone figure sits on a bench, a simple wooden cup in hand, a small lantern flickering beside them. Passers-by glance, some smile, some ignore, but the light casts a warm glow that cuts through the artificial neon of surrounding billboards. In that moment, the ancient Cynic's lamp reappears, not as a relic of antiquity, but as a living symbol of the possibility that one can, even amidst the noise of modernity, hold up a light that reveals the truth of our own excess. The journey from Diogenes to today is a winding path, marked by satire, asceticism, stoic rationality, existential rebellion, and contemporary minimalism. Each epoch has taken the core insight that freedom is found not in the accumulation of external goods, but in the cultivation of inner sufficiency, and reshaped it to speak to its own challenges. The Roman Cynics preserved the lamp through humor, the Christian hermits turned it toward the divine, the Stoics polished it for civic life, the existentialists ignited it against absurdity. The postmodern critics warned of its co-option, and the modern minimalists hold it aloft as a beacon against consumerism. In reflecting on this lineage, we are invited to ask ourselves, what does the Cynic's lamp illuminate in our own lives? Is it a call to strip away the superfluous, to question the narratives that bind us, to live with a deliberate honesty that may unsettle those around us? Or does it become a decorative token, a fashionable statement divorced from its radical roots? The answer perhaps lies not in a single proclamation but in an ongoing practice, a willingness to examine each possession, each desire, each social norm, and to decide, moment by moment, whether we are living in the light of Diogenes' lamp or merely standing in its shadow. May we, as seekers of truth, carry forward that ancient lamp with both humility and courage, allowing its modest flame to guide us through the complexities of our age, just as Diogenes once guided himself through the streets of Athens, lantern in hand, searching for an honest man. And perhaps in that search we may discover that the honest man we seek is, in fact, ourselves, waiting to be uncovered beneath the layers of possession, expectation, and convention that we have accumulated. Thus, the influence and legacy of Diogenes endure, not as a static doctrine, but as a living, breathing challenge to each generation. To live simply to speak truth, to illuminate the darkness, and to remain ever ready to say, even to the most powerful, "Step aside, you are blocking my sunlight." This final echo, reverberating from ancient Athens to the digital age, reminds us that the most profound revolutions often begin with a single, naked figure, a lantern, and an uncompromising commitment to authenticity. When we turn our attention to the figure of Diogenes of Sinope, the first image that often springs to mind is that of a man wandering the streets of Athens with a lantern, searching not for a lost object but for an honest man. "I am looking for an honest man," he declared, his voice echoing against marble columns and market stalls alike. That single, stark sentence carries within it a whole philosophy of radical self-sufficiency, autarkeia, paired with a relentless critique of social convention. As we ask ourselves whether this ancient cynic can speak to the complexities of a globally interdependent world, we must first unpack what autarkeia truly entails, and then examine how its core tenets intersect with the tangled webs of modern life. Autarkeia, in the cynic sense, is not merely a personal preference for simple living. It is a deliberate, almost ascetic, rejection of external goods, status, and even the comforts that most societies consider essential. Diogenes famously discarded his cup after observing a child drinking directly from his hands, proclaiming that "the child is wiser than I." In that moment, he illustrated a principle that has resonated through the ages. The fewer the dependencies, the freer the soul. Yet freedom, in contemporary terms, is rarely measured solely by the absence of possessions. It is also defined by the capacity to engage, to collaborate, to share resources across borders that stretch far beyond the agora of ancient Greece. Can the cynic's ideal of self-sufficiency coexist with the reality that our economies, our ecosystems, and even our identities are now woven together in a planetary tapestry? To explore this tension, let us consider two vivid modern case studies. The first is the Bruderhof, an intentional community founded in the early 20th century, which today spans continents from the United Kingdom to the United States and beyond. Members of the Bruderhof live together in shared houses, pool their incomes, and practice a form of communal ownership that echoes Diogenes' disdain for private property. They grow their own food, limit their consumption, and deliberately distance themselves from the consumerist pressures of mainstream society. Yet, unlike the solitary cynic who rejected all social ties, the Bruderhof embraces a collective identity, recognizing that mutual support can amplify the very autonomy they seek. Their model demonstrates that a disciplined reduction of material dependence can be harmonized with a network of interdependence, provided that the community's values are oriented toward shared flourishing rather than individual isolation. The second case study belongs to the digital realm, where a growing number of influencers champion what is called digital minimalism. Think of Cal Newport, who writes about the digital declutter, or the pair known as the minimalists, who have built a worldwide audience by urging people to strip away the noise of constant notifications, endless scrolling, and the endless acquisition of virtual status symbols. Their message resonates with Diogenes' call to live according to nature, to strip away the superfluous and focus on what truly matters. Yet, unlike the ancient cynic who carried a lantern in daylight, these modern advocates harness technology to amplify their message, using podcasts, YouTube channels, and social media to reach millions. In doing so, they embody a paradox. They advocate for less, while simultaneously relying on the very platforms they critique to disseminate their ideas. This paradox invites us to ask whether the spirit of autarkeia can be adapted, not as a total withdrawal from the world, but as a strategic engagement that uses the tools of the age to promote a simpler, more intentional life. The ethical viability of Diogenes' philosophy therefore hinges on a nuanced reading of his insistence on self-sufficiency. If we interpret autarkeia as an absolute withdrawal, then it clashes sharply with the interdependent nature of modern economies, where supply chains stretch across oceans and climate change demands coordinated global action. However, if we see Diogenes' radical simplicity as a methodological tool, a way to expose the excesses and hypocrisies of our societies, then his teachings can serve as a compass pointing toward responsible consumption, even within a globally linked framework. In this light, his philosophy does not deny interdependence. Rather, it questions the quality and fairness of the dependencies we have constructed. Turning now to social responsibility, we must ask whether Diogenes' public provocation, his habit of shocking the polis, of confronting powerful figures with biting sarcasm, has a place in today's discourse. Imagine a modern activist strolling through a corporate headquarters, holding up a sign that reads, "What are you feeding your children?" and refusing to leave until a CEO engages in conversation. This act mirrors Diogenes' famous encounter with Alexander the Great, when the ruler offered to grant him any wish and Diogenes replied, "Stand out of my sunlight." The cynic's retort was not merely a personal rebuff. It was a public demonstration that power should not be taken for granted. In contemporary terms, such provocation can serve as a catalyst for public awareness, forcing complacent audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about wealth, privilege, and environmental degradation. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of provocation is contested. Critics argue that shock tactics may alienate rather than persuade, that they can reinforce a binary of us versus them, and obscure the possibility of constructive dialogue. Feminist scholars, for instance, have highlighted how Diogenes' disregard for gendered power structures renders his provocations blind to the lived realities of women and non-binary individuals. In ancient Athens, the public sphere was dominated by men, and Diogenes' antics took place in a context where women were largely excluded from political debate. When he mocked the customs of the time, he did not extend his critique to the patriarchal norms that silenced half the population. Contemporary feminist philosophers such as Judith Butler would argue that any ethical stance that fails to address intersecting oppressions is incomplete, and that a truly responsible provocation must be attuned to the ways in which power operates across gender, race, and class. Environmental ethicists also raise a potent counter-argument. While Diogenes' asceticism appears to align with a low-impact lifestyle, his philosophy was rooted in personal virtue rather than a systemic ecological vision. The cynic's focus on individual self-sufficiency does not address the collective action required to mitigate climate change, biodiversity loss, or resource depletion. As the philosopher Timothy Morton reminds us, the Anthropocene demands a dark ecology that acknowledges our entanglement with the non-human world. Diogenes, in his time, could simply discard a cup or live in a barrel without considering the broader planetary consequences of his choices. In an era where a single individual's consumption can ripple through global supply chains, the cynic's model may appear insufficiently robust to meet ecological imperatives. These critiques do not, however, render Diogenes irrelevant. Instead, they invite us to reinterpret his teachings in dialogue with contemporary thinkers. Peter Singer, the architect of effective altruism, emphasizes that moral action should be guided by the capacity to do the most good with the resources at hand. Singer's calculus, maximizing well-being while minimizing suffering, shares a kinship with Diogenes' disdain for wasteful excess. Yet Singer extends the principle beyond personal austerity to a global ethic of giving, urging those with surplus to direct it toward the most pressing needs, whether that be alleviating extreme poverty or funding life-saving vaccinations. In this sense, we might imagine a modern cynic who, after shedding superfluous possessions, redirects the time and energy saved toward effective altruistic endeavors, thereby marrying autarkia with a profound sense of social responsibility. Elaine de Botton, on the other hand, champions a practical philosophy that seeks to make wisdom accessible and applicable to everyday life. De Botton's Philosophy for Life series argues that philosophical ideas should be integrated into the fabric of our routines, not hoarded as abstract doctrines. From this perspective, Diogenes' radical lifestyle can be softened into a series of habits: mindful consumption, critical questioning of social norms, and the cultivation of inner resilience, without demanding the full withdrawal from society that the ancient cynic exemplified. De Botton would likely suggest that we adopt the spirit of Diogenes' lamp, using it to illuminate the hidden corners of our own lives, while still engaging with the world in a compassionate and constructive manner. To illustrate how such integration might look in practice, consider the analogy of a gardener pruning a tree. The gardener does not uproot the tree entirely. Instead, he removes the dead branches that sap the plant's vitality, allowing the remaining limbs to flourish. Diogenes, in this metaphor, is the gardener of the soul, cutting away the cultural vines of vanity, ambition, and complacency. The modern practitioner, however, also waters the roots, ensuring that the tree remains connected to the soil of community, ecology, and shared purpose. This balanced approach respects the cynic's call for self-purification while acknowledging the necessity of nurturing connections that sustain collective well-being. Historical anecdotes further illuminate the tension between radical autonomy and communal responsibility. One story recounts how Diogenes once entered a banquet hall, took a seat at the head of the table, and proceeded to eat a simple piece of bread while the aristocrats feasted on exotic delicacies. When a wealthy patron asked why he would deprive himself of such pleasures, Diogenes replied, I am already full of virtue. The episode underscores his belief that moral sufficiency, not material abundance, constitutes true nourishment. Yet another anecdote tells of a young Stoic, Musonius Rufus, who visited Diogenes and asked whether the cynic ever felt loneliness. Diogenes responded, "I have the company of my own thoughts, and that is sufficient." Here we see the paradox. The cynic's self-sufficiency is both a source of strength and a potential barrier to relational depth. In the 21st century, we encounter similar paradoxes. The digital minimalism movement, for instance, encourages individuals to step back from the incessant chatter of social media, yet many participants still rely on a modest online presence to share their insights and build supportive networks. The Bruderhof community, while striving for economic simplicity, must navigate the challenges of modern healthcare, education, and legal systems that require interaction with the broader society. These real-world examples demonstrate that the pure form of Diogenes' autarkeia, complete disengagement, is rarely feasible, but the underlying ethos can be adapted to foster intentional, mindful living within a connected world. When we evaluate the ethical viability of Diogenes' philosophy, it is helpful to return to his own words. He once said, "I am looking for an honest man, but I cannot find one." The cynic's search was less about locating a singular individual than about exposing the pervasive dishonesty embedded in social conventions. In our age, honesty takes on new dimensions. Transparency in corporate supply chains, authenticity in digital communication, and truthfulness in scientific reporting. If we adopt Diogenes' relentless questioning, we can interrogate the narratives that justify overconsumption, the policies that privilege profit over planetary health, and the ideologies that marginalize vulnerable populations. In doing so, we honor the spirit of his critique while applying it to the complex ethical landscape of the present. Yet we must also heed the feminist critique that reminds us of the limits of Diogenes' perspective. In a world where gendered power dynamics shape everything from wage gaps to representation in leadership, a philosophy that does not explicitly address these structures risks perpetuating silence. Modern reinterpretations can bridge this gap by coupling the cynic's disdain for material excess with a commitment to gender equity. For instance, a contemporary cynic might reject not only luxury goods but also the patriarchal symbols that confer status, titles, hierarchical offices, and even certain language that reinforces gender binaries. By extending the cynic's radical simplicity to include the dismantling of gendered expectations, we create a more inclusive ethical framework. Environmental ethicists, too, can find fertile ground for dialogue with Diogenes. While his asceticism alone may not solve the climate crisis, it can inspire a cultural shift toward valuing sufficiency over abundance. The concept of degrowth, championed by scholars such as Diogenes Callis, aligns with the cynic's rejection of endless expansion. Degrowth advocates for a deliberate contraction of production and consumption in wealthy societies, redirecting resources towards social welfare and ecological restoration. If we view Diogenes as an early harbinger of degrowth thinking, we can appreciate his legacy as a catalyst for contemporary ecological movements that demand systemic change rather than isolated personal sacrifice. Peter Singer's effective altruism offers a concrete pathway for integrating cynic insights without slipping into nihilism. Imagine a person who, inspired by Diogenes, sells unnecessary possessions, reduces their carbon footprint, and then channels the financial savings into high-impact charities, perhaps supporting malaria nets, deworming programs, or climate mitigation projects. This individual embodies both the cynic's self-discipline and the altruist's commitment to making a measurable difference. The key is to avoid the trap of do nothing because the world is corrupt, a stance that could be read from Diogenes' contempt for societal norms. Instead, we can adopt a stance of do what is necessary and do it with integrity, thereby preserving the cynic's moral rigor while embracing compassionate action. Alain de Botton's practical philosophy further refines this integration. He would suggest that we cultivate daily habits, such as mindful eating, intentional walking, and reflective journaling, that echo Diogenes' emphasis on living in accordance with nature. At the same time, we maintain open channels for dialogue, empathy, and collaboration, recognizing that human flourishing is a shared project. In de Botton's view, philosophy should serve as a toolbox, not a monolith. The cynic's lantern becomes one of many tools we carry, illuminating specific corners of our lives while we also employ the compass of virtue ethics, the map of social contract theory, and the telescope of environmental stewardship. Let us now consider how these ideas might be operationalized in concrete, everyday actions. First, we might adopt a cynic-inspired audit of our possessions, asking for each item. Does it serve a genuine purpose, or does it merely signal status? This question echoes Diogenes' disdain for ostentation, yet it is framed not as a call to total renunciation, but as a prompt for intentional choice. Second, we could practice public provocation in a constructive manner, perhaps by organizing a community forum where participants are invited to critique local policies on waste management, housing, or transportation, using humor and satire to lower defenses. By channeling Diogenes' shock value into structured civic engagement, we transform provocation into a catalyst for collective problem solving. Third, we might engage with digital minimalism by setting clear boundaries. Designating screen-free hours, curating social media feeds to include only content that enriches rather than distracts, and using technology deliberately to amplify messages of sustainability and equity. In this way, we honor the Cynic's call to strip away the superfluous while leveraging the tools of our age to spread the very values we seek to embody. Fourth, we could look to intentional communities like the Bruderhof for models of shared resource management, learning how collective ownership can reduce waste, foster mutual support, and create resilient microeconomies. By visiting such communities or participating in short-term residencies, individuals can experience firsthand the balance between self-sufficiency and interdependence. In integrating these practices, it is essential to remain vigilant against the dangers of extreme nihilism, a potential pitfall when one adopts the Cynic's critique without a constructive alternative. Diogenes' famous retort to Alexander, "Stand out of my sunlight," exemplifies a refusal to be co-opted by power, yet it also suggests a withdrawal into personal autonomy that can be misread as disengagement. To avoid this, we must pair the Cynic's rejection of superficial values with a proactive vision for how to rebuild those values on more equitable and sustainable foundations. This is where the insights of Singer and de Botton converge. They provide a roadmap for turning critical distance into purposeful action. Returning to the primary sources, let us recall Diogenes' own words when he was asked why he lived in a barrel. He answered, "I am not ashamed of my poverty, because my poverty is a sign of my freedom." This declaration encapsulates a paradox that remains strikingly relevant. Poverty, when voluntarily embraced as a philosophical stance, can be an expression of liberty, but when imposed by systemic injustice, it is a source of oppression. Modern readers must differentiate between the two, using Diogenes' example to interrogate the structures that produce involuntary deprivation while preserving the autonomy to choose simplicity. Another poignant quote comes from the moment when Diogenes was confronted by a child who asked for a piece of bread. The Cynic gave the child his own bread, saying, "Take what you need, for the world is already full of excess." In this gesture, Diogenes demonstrates that generosity can arise from a life of minimalism, not despite it. The act of sharing a simple loaf becomes a powerful ethical statement, that abundance need not be hoarded, that the surplus of one can become the sustenance of another. In a world where food waste reaches staggering levels, this ancient anecdote challenges us to re-evaluate our relationship to consumption and distribution. To deepen our understanding, we can draw a cross-reference to the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who, though differing in many respects, also emphasized inner freedom over external circumstance. Epictetus taught that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Diogenes, in his own way, practiced this by refusing to let societal expectations dictate his contentment. By juxtaposing cynicism with stoicism, we see a spectrum of attitudes toward external goods, the Cynic's outright rejection, the Stoics' measured indifference. Modern readers can navigate this spectrum, choosing the points that align with their personal and communal goals. In the realm of feminist philosophy, we might also look to Bell Hooks, who insists that love and justice are inseparable. Hooks' emphasis on the practice of love as a force for transformation can be woven into a Cynic-inspired ethic that does not merely reject the world, but seeks to heal it through compassionate engagement. Imagine a Diogenes who, instead of simply mocking the power structures of his day, also offers a hand to those marginalized by those very structures, perhaps by sharing his scant resources, by listening attentively, by creating spaces where unheard voices can be heard. This reimagined Cynic becomes a bridge between radical critique and restorative action. Environmental ethicists such as Joanna Macy, who proposes the work that reconnects, argue that ecological crisis demands both personal transformation and collective activism. Macy's concept of the Great Turning resonates with Diogenes' call to live in harmony with nature, yet it expands the scope to include systemic change. By integrating the Cynic's personal austerity with Macy's ecological vision, we can envision a practice that begins with reducing one's carbon footprint and extends to participating in climate justice movements, supporting renewable energy initiatives and advocating for policies that protect vulnerable ecosystems. As we synthesize these diverse threads, a picture emerges of a philosophy that is not static but dynamic, a living conversation between ancient critique and contemporary challenge. Diogenes' lamp, once held aloft in the bright sun of Athens, can still illuminate today's dark corners. The consumerist treadmill that drives us to endless acquisition, the complacent discourse that shrouds systemic injustice, and the ecological blind spots that threaten our planetary home. By asking, as Diogenes did, what is the honest man, we compel ourselves to examine the honesty of our own choices, the transparency of our institutions, and the integrity of our collective narratives. In practical terms, integrating Cynic insights without slipping into nihilism might involve a three-step framework. First, conduct a Cynic audit of personal habits, cataloging possessions, digital habits, and social engagements, and then identifying which elements serve authentic purpose and which merely reinforce status. Second, translate the insights from that audit into concrete community actions, whether by volunteering at a local food bank, joining a climate strike, or facilitating a public discussion that challenges prevailing norms. Third, maintain a reflective practice, perhaps through daily journaling or meditative walks, that revisits the core question of what is enough and adjusts one's path accordingly. This iterative process honors the Cynic's relentless questioning while embedding it within a compassionate, socially responsible framework. To close, let us return to the image of Diogenes holding his lantern in the bright day, searching for an honest man. In our modern era, the lantern may be a smartphone screen, a social media post, or a quiet moment of contemplation. The search remains the same: to find authenticity, to strip away the veneer of falsehood, and to live in a way that aligns with our deepest values. Whether we find that honesty in a Bruderhof communal kitchen, in the minimalist workspace of a digital influencer, or in the quiet resolve of a climate activist, the spirit of Diogenes endures. It challenges us to ask, what do I truly need? And more importantly, what can I give? In answering these questions, we honor the ancient Cynic while forging a path that is both ethically viable and socially responsible. A path that acknowledges our global interdependence, respects gendered experiences, and confronts the ecological crises of our time. The lantern, then, is not a tool for isolation, but a beacon for collective awakening, guiding us toward a world where simplicity and solidarity walk hand in hand.